Story 1. The Repeating Mile Marker. Jake Thornton had been driving cross-country routes for 17 years, and in that time he'd developed an almost supernatural sense of distance and time. He could tell you within 5 minutes when he'd arrive at any destination, could feel the weight shifts in his load before the scales confirmed it, and knew every major highway between Seattle and Miami like the back of his weathered hands. That's why what happened on Interstate 80 through Nebraska that October night shattered everything he thought he understood about the world. It started normally enough. Jake had picked up a load of industrial machinery parts in Omaha, bound for a manufacturing plant in Cheyenne. The manifest showed 42,000 pounds, well within his rig's capacity, and the route was straightforward. Straight shot west on I-80 about 500 miles, which he'd driven hundreds of times before. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, no wind advisories, perfect conditions for night driving when the traffic thinned out and he could make good time. He pulled out of the warehouse district at 10:47 p.m., his logbook properly filled out, his GPS calibrated, and his CB radio crackling with the usual chatter from other drivers heading into the night. The first hour passed without incident. Jake maintained a steady 67 miles per hour, his cruise control locked in, his headlights cutting through the darkness of the Nebraska prairie. The landscape out here was monotonous even in daylight, endless flat fields, occasional farmhouses set back from the road, grain silos rising like sentinels against the horizon. At night, it became a tunnel of highway illuminated only by his truck's lights and the reflective paint on the mile markers that appeared every 5,280 feet. Mile marker 3997 passed on his right. Jake noted it unconsciously, part of the mental calculations he always performed to track his progress. At his current speed, he'd see mile marker 398 in exactly 68 seconds. He counted down in his head, a habit from his early driving days that he'd never broken. 68 seconds later, his headlights caught the reflective green sign. Mile marker 397. Jake blinked, certain he'd misread it. But no, there it was, clear as day, 397. He glanced at his speedometer. 67 miles per hour, steady as always. He checked his odometer. It had advanced exactly 1/10 of a mile since the last marker. Everything about his truck's instrumentation told him he was moving forward at normal speed. Yet he'd just passed the same mile marker twice. He keyed his CB radio. Any drivers out on I-80 westbound near mile marker 397? This is Big Bear, looking for a radio check. Static answered him. He tried again, cycling through several channels. Nothing but empty static on every frequency. That was unusual. There were always drivers on I-80, especially the long haulers who drove through the night to avoid the heat and traffic. But Jake had heard dead radio before in remote areas where the terrain played tricks with signals. He was probably just in a dead zone. He focused on the road ahead, watching for the next mile marker. His headlights reached out about 400 feet, plenty of warning for any obstacles. The highway stretched straight ahead, the white dashed center line disappearing toward the horizon. No other vehicles in sight, no lights from towns or farms. Just the prairie darkness surrounding his island of light. Mile marker 397 appeared on his right. This time Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His heart rate kicked up, that primitive alarm system that all humans possess starting to ping warnings in his brain. He definitely moved forward. He could feel the road passing beneath his tires, could see the centerline dashes appearing from the darkness and vanishing behind him. His truck's engine maintained its steady rumble. Everything felt normal. Everything except that goddamned mile marker. He grabbed his phone from the dash mount, intending to check his GPS. No signal. The screen showed the searching icon spinning endlessly. That wasn't uncommon in rural Nebraska, but combined with the dead CB radio and the impossible mile marker, it felt ominous. Jake decided to test something. He carefully noted his odometer reading. 287,443.7 miles. Then he watched the road, counting the seconds. At 67 miles per hour, he should cover 1 mile in approximately 54 seconds. He counted slowly, methodically, marking each second with a tap on his steering wheel. 54 seconds elapsed. His odometer read 287,444.7 miles, 1 full mile traveled according to every instrument in his truck. Mile marker 397 appeared on his right. "What the hell?" Jake spoke aloud, his voice sounding strange in the cab's confined space. He'd now passed the same mile marker 4 times, yet his truck insisted he'd traveled 4 miles. The disconnect between what his instruments reported and what the road signs showed created a nauseating cognitive dissonance. He tried the CB again. "This is Big Bear on I-80 westbound. Is anyone hearing this? I need a radio check." His voice sounded desperate now, the professional trucker calm cracking. Only static answered. The next mile marker appeared. 397, then again, and again. Jake lost count after the 20th repetition. His odometer showed he'd traveled more than 30 miles, but he kept passing the same marker. He tried slowing down, dropping his speed to 40 miles per hour. Mile marker 397. He accelerated to 75, pushing his rig harder than he should with a full load. Mile marker 397. He watched the centerline dashes, counting them. Each dash was 10 feet long, each gap 30 feet according to federal highway standards. He was definitely moving forward, consuming distance, yet arriving nowhere. The logical part of his brain, the part trained by 17 years of professional driving, insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe the highway department had screwed up, posted multiple 397 markers by mistake. But that didn't explain his dead CB radio, his lack of cell signal, or the complete absence of any other traffic. On a normal night, even at 2 a.m., he'd see at least a few vehicles, other truckers, late-night travelers, emergency vehicles. But for the past hour, he'd seen nothing but his own headlights and that endlessly repeating mile marker. He tried to focus on details, looking for any changes in the landscape. But the prairie darkness revealed nothing. No farmhouses, no fence posts, no trees, no variation whatsoever. Just flat emptiness and the highway stretching ahead into infinite darkness. Jake's throat went dry. He grabbed his water bottle and drank, the cool liquid doing nothing to calm the rising panic in his chest. He was stuck somehow, trapped in a loop of highway that shouldn't exist. The impossibility of it warred with the undeniable evidence of his senses. This wasn't fatigue. He'd fought drowsiness before and knew what highway hypnosis felt like. This was different. This was real. Mile marker 397 passed again. And again. He decided to try something drastic. At the next appearance of the marker, he would slam on his brakes and stop completely. Maybe breaking the pattern would break whatever was happening. He prepared himself, foot hovering over the brake pedal, watching for the familiar green sign. There. Mile marker 397. Jake stomped the brake pedal hard. His air brakes engaged with a hissing roar and his truck began its controlled deceleration, the load shifting slightly forward against the trailer restraints. The anti-lock braking system pulsed under his foot as the rig slowed from 67 to 40 to 20 to 10 miles per hour. Just before he came to a complete stop, mile marker 397 flashed past on his right. "No, no, no!" Jake shouted, releasing the brake and accelerating again. He couldn't afford to stop. Some instinct screamed at him that stopping would be worse. That motion was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. As long as he kept moving, kept his truck rolling forward, he remained in control somehow. But he wasn't in control. That was becoming horrifyingly clear. He noticed something new then. The stars were wrong. Jake wasn't an astronomer, but he'd spent enough nights under the open sky to recognize the major constellations. He could usually spot the Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, Cassiopeia. But when he leaned forward and looked up through his windshield, the stars formed patterns he'd never seen before. They seemed brighter, closer, and arranged in configurations that made his eyes hurt to follow. Mile marker 397. The sign looked different now, though Jake couldn't pinpoint exactly how. Same green, reflective surface, same white numbers. But there was something off about the proportions, as if he were seeing it through slightly distorted glass. His fuel gauge drew his attention. He'd started with 3/4 of a tank, roughly 225 gallons of diesel. Now the gauge read just under half. He'd burned approximately 90 gallons, which at his rig's typical fuel economy meant he should have traveled around 600 miles. His odometer confirmed similar numbers, yet he remained trapped at mile marker 397. A new fear gripped him. What would happen when he ran out of fuel? Would he be stuck here forever, his truck gradually going silent, leaving him alone in this impossible stretch of highway? He imagined himself sitting in the dark cab, watching mile marker 397 somehow continue appearing even without motion, trapped in this nowhere place until he died of thirst or starvation or simply gave up. "Think, Jake, think," he muttered to himself. There had to be something he was missing, some detail that would explain this or provide an escape. He reviewed everything that had happened since leaving Omaha. The loading process had been normal. The warehouse workers had been ordinary people, his manifest paperwork standard. He'd stopped at a Flying J truck stop just outside Omaha for fuel and a coffee. The clerk had been a middle-aged woman named Denise, who'd worked there for years and knew him by name. Everything had been normal. Mile marker 397 appeared, and again. The repetition had become almost hypnotic, a metronome marking impossible time. Jake's hands shook on the steering wheel now. He'd been trapped in this loop for, he checked his clock, 3 hours and 17 minutes. His fuel gauge continued its steady decline toward empty. He had perhaps 2 more hours before his truck would sputter and die, stranding him here. Then he saw something different. Far ahead, beyond where his headlights reached, a light appeared on the highway. Small at first, it grew larger as he approached. Another vehicle. Relief flooded through Jake's body. He wasn't alone. Someone else was on this road. Someone who might have answers, or at least confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. But as his headlights finally reached the vehicle ahead, Jake's relief transformed into ice-cold horror. It was a Peterbilt 579, blue with chrome details, pulling a 53-foot trailer. Exactly like his truck. The license plate matched his own. He could see the dent in the rear door where he'd backed into a loading dock in Phoenix 2 years ago. The mud flaps bore the same custom design he'd installed last spring. He was looking at his own truck, somehow ahead of him on the highway. Jake's mind refused to process what he was seeing. He lifted his foot from the accelerator and his truck began to slow. The truck ahead, his truck ahead, also slowed, maintaining the exact same distance. When he accelerated, so did the other truck. When he touched his brakes, the brake lights ahead flashed in perfect synchronization. Mile marker 397 appeared between him and the truck ahead. Then another 397 marker appeared and another, creating a corridor of impossible repetition. Understanding crashed over Jake like a physical wave. He wasn't just repeating the same mile of highway. He was repeating himself. Time had folded in on itself somehow, creating a loop where he was following his own path, chasing his own taillights through an endless corridor of fractured reality. He slammed on his brakes, determined to break the loop even if it meant stopping completely. His truck decelerated rapidly, the brake lights ahead mirroring his actions. But instead of pulling ahead, the distance remained constant, as if space itself was contracting to maintain the separation. At 30 miles per hour, Jake noticed his fuel gauge dipping below a quarter tank. At 20 miles per hour, a new sound emerged from somewhere behind his truck, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the cab. At 10 miles per hour, his mirrors showed something that made his bladder loosen with terror. Behind him, stretching back into the darkness, was an infinite line of blue Peterbilt trucks, each identical to his own, each following exactly in his path. Mile markers reading 397 appeared between each truck, creating a corridor of repeating vehicles and repeating signs that vanished into impossible distance. Jake screamed and floored the accelerator. His engine roared, his truck surged forward, and the thrumming sound grew louder, more insistent. The truck ahead pulled away, or tried to, but the distance never changed. His speedometer climbed past 80 miles per hour, dangerously fast for a loaded rig, but Jake was beyond caring about safety regulations. Mile marker 397 flashed past faster now, appearing every few seconds instead of every minute, the repetition accelerating with his speed. The stars above swirled in patterns that hurt to perceive. The darkness on either side of the highway seemed to press inward, as if reality itself was narrowing to this single corridor of impossible space. Then as suddenly as it began, it ended. Mile marker 398 appeared on his right, then 399, then 400. Jake's CB radio erupted with voices. Traffic backup near Lincoln, recommend alternate. Fuel prices are insane at this. Anyone got the weather report for... Normal trucker chatter, the most beautiful sound Jake had ever heard. His cell phone chimed with a flood of delayed notifications. His GPS screen refreshed, showing his location at mile marker 401 on I-80, exactly where he should be based on his departure time and speed. Everything was normal again. Jake pulled onto the shoulder, his whole body shaking so badly he could barely control the truck. He sat there for 20 minutes, hyperventilating, crying, checking and rechecking his instruments. His odometer showed he'd traveled the expected distance from Omaha. His clock showed the correct time. His fuel gauge displayed reasonable consumption. But he knew what he'd experienced. He knew he'd been trapped, caught in some fold of reality that shouldn't exist. When he finally composed himself enough to continue, Jake drove straight through to Cheyenne without stopping, delivered his load, and immediately deadheaded back to his terminal in Denver. He told dispatch he was done with night driving, effective immediately. They could assign him day routes only, or he'd find another company to work for. They accommodated him, probably figuring he was just getting old, losing his nerve for the loneliness of night hauls. Jake never corrected them. He never told anyone what really happened on I-80 that October night. But sometimes when he's driving during the day and passes mile marker 397 on any highway, any state, he feels a chill run down his spine, and he accelerates just a little faster until that number is well behind him, terrified that the loop might catch him again, might pull him back into that impossible corridor where space and time fold in on themselves and trap travelers in eternal repetition. He still drives trucks. He's good at it, even on his strict daylight-only schedule. But Jake Thornton knows something now that most people never learn and should never have to. The highways we travel aren't always as linear as the maps suggest. And sometimes the road you're on isn't really a road at all, but something else entirely. Something that exists in the cracks between normal space, waiting to catch the unwary and hold them forever in its impossible embrace. Story 2. The Phantom Passenger. Maria Delgado had driven for Swift Transportation for 9 years, earning a reputation as one of their most reliable regional drivers. She specialized in the Southwest Circuit, Phoenix to Albuquerque to El Paso and back, running refrigerated loads that required precision timing and constant temperature monitoring. At 34 years old, she'd logged over 900,000 miles without a single accident, a record that made her supervisors confident enough to assign her the premium routes that carried the highest value cargo. She was professional, punctual, and preferred to drive alone, which is why what happened on Highway 60 between Socorro and Magdalena, New Mexico, was so deeply disturbing. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Emergency load, temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals from the research facility outside Socorro to a medical distribution center in Springerville, Arizona. The manifest showed $83,000 worth of experimental medications that required constant refrigeration between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Any temperature deviation would spoil the entire load and cost the company a substantial amount of money, not to mention the potential setback to whatever research depended on these drugs. Maria accepted the load without hesitation. She knew the route well. Highway 60 west from Socorro was a lonely stretch of road through the high desert, but it was well maintained and relatively straight. The weather forecast showed clear conditions, no snow or ice predicted for late November, and her reefer unit had just passed its monthly inspection. She could make the delivery by midnight, grab some sleep at the truck stop in Springerville, and be back in Phoenix by Thursday morning with another load already lined up. She hooked up to the loaded trailer at 4:37 p.m., performed her standard pre-trip inspection, and verified the reefer unit was maintaining proper temperature. Everything checked out perfectly. She pulled out of the facility as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that she'd seen thousands of times but still found beautiful. The drive started normally. Maria headed west on Highway 60, climbing gradually into the San Mateo Mountains. Traffic was light. A few passenger vehicles, one other truck heading east that she passed with a friendly air horn exchange. Her reefer unit hummed steadily behind her, the temperature display on her dash showing a steady 36 degrees. Perfect. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, the way it always did in November. One moment the sky was twilight blue, the next it was full dark with stars emerging overhead. Maria turned on her headlights and settled into the rhythm of the drive. Her satellite radio played classic rock at low volume, just loud enough to keep her alert without being distracting. The highway climbed and curved through the mountains, her headlights sweeping across rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. She'd been driving for about an hour when she first felt the presence. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Just a subtle change in the cab's atmosphere, a sense that she wasn't quite alone. Maria glanced at her passenger seat, saw nothing but her thermos and logbook, and shook off the feeling. Long-haul truckers often experience that sensation. The isolation of the cab could play tricks on your mind, making you hyper-aware of every small sound and sensation. But the feeling persisted and grew stronger. The air in the cab felt denser somehow, as if another person's presence was displacing space. Maria checked her mirrors, confirming no other vehicles were nearby. She was alone on this stretch of highway, climbing through the mountains under a clear, cold sky. Then she heard the breathing. It was soft, barely audible over the rumble of her engine and the hum of the reefer unit, but definitely there, a slow, measured respiration that didn't match her own breathing pattern. Maria's heart rate spiked. She turned down her radio completely, listening intently. The breathing continued steady and calm, coming from somewhere behind her right shoulder. She spun in her seat, looking at the sleeper berth behind her cab. Empty. Her emergency supplies, a few, changes of clothes, nothing else. Yet the breathing persisted, now seeming to come from the passenger seat. Maria looked to her right. For just a fraction of a second, she saw something. Not a complete figure, but an outline. The suggestion of a person sitting in her passenger seat, visible only as a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer on a summer highway. Then it vanished, leaving only empty seat and darkness beyond her window. "Jesus Christ," Maria whispered, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. She was seeing things, had to be. Maybe she'd developed carbon monoxide poisoning from an exhaust leak. She cracked her window, letting cold mountain air blast into the cab, clearing her head. The breathing didn't stop. If anything, it became more pronounced, accompanied now by another sound, a wet, clicking quality, as if whoever was breathing had fluid in their lungs. Maria's training kicked in. Stay calm, stay focused, get to a safe location. The next town was Magdalena, about 30 miles ahead. She could stop there, call dispatch, get someone to check her truck for mechanical issues that might be causing auditory hallucinations. She increased her speed slightly, eager to reach civilization and other people. The temperature alarm on her dash started beeping. Maria glanced at the reefer display, 32 degrees and dropping. Too cold. If the temperature went below 34 for more than 15 minutes, the entire load would be compromised. She accessed the reefer controls on her dash screen, adjusting the thermostat back up. The unit responded, the display showing the temperature stabilizing at 35 degrees. The breathing beside her changed, becoming faster, almost excited. And then, impossibly, the passenger seat belt moved. Maria watched in horror as the seat belt slowly extracted from its housing, pulled across the empty seat and clicked into its buckle. The belt tightened slightly, creating an indentation in the seat cushion, as if an invisible person was sitting there, secured safely for the drive. "No, no, no," Maria chanted, her voice rising in pitch. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She reached over and yanked on the seat belt. It resisted for a moment, then released with a click, retracting back into its housing. The indentation in the seat cushion remained for several seconds before slowly fading. The temperature alarm beeped again. Maria looked at the display, 28 degrees and still dropping. That was impossible. She just adjusted the thermostat, and the reefer unit was functioning normally according to all indicators. She input another adjustment, pushing the temperature setting higher. The breathing next to her turned into something that might have been laughter, a low, wheezing sound that raised every hair on Maria's body. The cab's interior temperature dropped noticeably, her breath suddenly visible in the air despite the heater running full. Blast! Then the radio turned on by itself. Maria had switched it off minutes ago, but now it crackled to life, cycling through stations with no input from her. Country music, Spanish-language talk radio, static, Christian programming, classic rock, flipping rapidly through the spectrum as if invisible fingers were spinning the dial. It settled finally on a station playing nothing but dead air, a flat, empty frequency that shouldn't have been broadcasting at all. Through the dead air came a voice, male, rough, speaking words Maria couldn't quite make out, as if someone was talking underwater or from a great distance. The voice rose and fell, sometimes louder, sometimes fading to barely audible, but always maintaining that strange, distorted quality. "Should have stopped," the voice said, suddenly clear. "Should have known." Maria slapped the power button on her radio. The display went dark, but the voice continued, now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, emanating from the cab itself. "Cold, so cold," the voice said. "Can't get warm, need to get warm." The reefer alarm screamed. 24 degrees. The entire load was compromised now. Thousands of dollars worth of medication ruined. But Maria didn't care about that anymore. She cared only about getting away from whatever was in her cab, whatever presence had attached itself to her truck. She saw lights ahead. Magdalena, finally. The small town appeared around a curve, a scatter of buildings and streetlights in the darkness. Maria aimed for them like a drowning person reaching for shore, her speed climbing to well above the posted limit. The presence intensified. The passenger seat depressed fully now, as if someone heavy was sitting there. Condensation formed on the passenger window in the shape of a handprint. Small fingers, a narrow palm. Then another handprint appeared, and another covering the glass in ghostly impressions. They left me, the voice said, now speaking directly into Maria's right ear, so close she could feel cold breath on her skin. Left me in the cold, left me to freeze. Maria screamed and swerved, her truck lurching across the center line before she regained control. Her headlights swept across a historical marker on the side of the road, there and gone in an instant. But Maria's brain registered the words. Tragic accident site, January 1987. She rocketed into Magdalena at 70 miles per hour, blasting through the town's single stoplight and pulling into the first business she saw. A combination gas station and diner that looked half abandoned. She slammed on her brakes, grabbed her phone, and threw open her door, practically falling out of the cab in her haste to escape. The moment her feet hit the pavement, everything stopped. The breathing ceased. The voice went silent. The oppressive presence that had filled her cab vanished instantly, like a switch being flipped. Maria stood in the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, shaking, gasping, her breath creating clouds in the cold November air. She stared at her truck, half expecting to see someone climbing out of the passenger side. But there was nothing. Just her truck sitting there, reefer unit humming, everything appearing completely normal. An older man emerged from the diner, a coffee cup in his hand. "You all right, miss?" he called out. "Saw you come in pretty hot there." Maria couldn't speak for a moment, then, My passenger. Did you see anyone in my truck?" The man walked closer, peering at her cab. "Truck? You're riding solo, aren't you? No sleeper team or nothing?" "Check the passenger seat," Maria insisted. "Please." The man obliged, walking around to the passenger side and looking through the window. "Empty, miss. Just some paperwork and a thermos. You feeling okay? Want me to call someone?" Maria forced herself to walk back to her truck. She climbed up and looked at the passenger seat herself. Empty. The seatbelt was properly retracted. No indentations on the cushion. The windows were clear, no handprints, no condensation. Her radio was off exactly as she'd left it. She checked her reefer display. 36 degrees, perfect temperature, as if it had never fluctuated. "Ma'am," the older man said, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine," Maria lied. "Just thought I saw something. Long drive, you know. Can I use your restroom?" Inside the diner, Maria splashed cold water on her face and tried to calm her racing heart. She pulled out her phone and did something she'd told herself she'd never do. She searched for information about Highway 60 and accidents. The results made her blood run cold. In January 1987, a mother and her 7-year-old daughter had died on Highway 60 near Magdalena when their car broke down during a snowstorm. They'd tried to walk to town for help but succumbed to hypothermia less than a mile from safety. The mother's body was found quickly, but the daughter's wasn't discovered until spring, partially concealed in a roadside culvert. Maria read the little girl's name, Jennifer Carson, age 7, died of exposure after being left alone in the cold while her mother tried to get help. Left me in the cold, left me to freeze. The voice echoed in Maria's memory. A child trapped in the reefer trailer's cold, reliving her death, trying to communicate through the only means available, the cold itself. Maria called dispatch and reported mechanical failure on her reefer unit. She arranged for another driver to come take over the load. She waited in the diner, drinking coffee she didn't taste, until the replacement driver arrived 3 hours later. She never mentioned the phantom passenger. She filed her incident report citing equipment malfunction and requested reassignment to different routes. Swift transportation granted, her request without question. They figured the reefer failure had spooked her, made her doubt her ability to handle temperature-sensitive cargo. They had no idea what had really happened in that cab on Highway 60. Maria still drives trucks, but she refuses any loads that require refrigeration. She won't drive Highway 60 between Socorro and Magdalena, not even during daylight hours. When dispatch asks why, she just says she prefers other routes, leaves it at that. But she knows the truth. She knows that Jennifer Carson is still out there, still riding in trucks that carry cold cargo, still trying to make drivers understand what happened to her, still desperately searching for warmth that she'll never feel again. And Maria knows that if she ever pulls another refrigerated load on that stretch of highway, the little girl will be waiting to climb into her passenger seat again, to breathe her frozen breath, to whisper her tragic story through the endless, terrible cold. Sometimes late at night when Maria is alone, she thinks about Jennifer Carson and cries for the little girl who died afraid and alone in the darkness. But she never goes back. Some ghosts should be left to their lonely vigils, and some roads should never be traveled again. Story 3: The Wrong Delivery. Robert Chen had been driving for FedEx Freight for 12 years, specializing in LTL, less-than-truckload shipments that required multiple stops and careful load organization. At 41 years old, he'd developed a reputation for being meticulous, the kind of driver who never missed a delivery window and never misplaced cargo. His truck was always organized, his paperwork always perfect, his customer interactions always professional. He took pride in his work, viewing each delivery as a personal promise that he would never break. That dedication made what happened in Winnemucca, Nevada, all the more horrifying. The load originated in Sacramento and included 17 separate deliveries across northern Nevada, everything from automotive parts to restaurant equipment to medical supplies. Robert had organized his trailer carefully, placing deliveries in reverse order so he could access each stop without having to shuffle cargo. His route was planned to the minute, accounting for drive time, unloading, and mandatory rest breaks. Everything was systematic, efficient, professional. He made his first 6 deliveries without incident, each stop going exactly as planned. By early afternoon, he was ahead of schedule and in good spirits, singing along with his 80s rock playlist as he drove between stops. Nevada's high desert stretched out around him, all sagebrush and distant mountains under a cloudless sky. The 7th delivery was in Winnemucca, a small city of about 8,000 people that served as a stop for travelers crossing Nevada on I-80. Robert's GPS guided him to an address on the industrial side of town, 2847 Desolation Road, a warehouse district near Charmeilles, the old railroad tracks. He found the street easily enough but had trouble locating the exact address. The buildings in this area were old, many showing signs of abandonment, and the address numbers were either missing or faded beyond legibility. Robert drove slowly, checking each building, searching for any indication of 2847. Then he saw it. A warehouse set back from the road, partially concealed behind 2 larger buildings. The structure looked old, brick construction, probably dating from the 1950s or earlier. A faded sign on the rolling steel door showed the numbers 2847, barely visible but definitely there. The building had no company name, no indication of what business operated there, but the address matched his manifest perfectly. Robert pulled his truck up to the loading dock, which was unusual because most of these older buildings had ground-level doors, not elevated docks. But he'd seen stranger setups. He checked his manifest. 47 boxes of restaurant supplies, total weight 823 pounds. The consignee was listed simply as WM Enterprises. No contact name, no phone number, which was irregular but not unheard of. He tried calling the delivery contact number on his manifest. The phone rang 6 times, then connected to a voicemail system with a computerized voice that didn't identify the business. Robert left a message stating he'd arrived with the delivery, then waited 5 minutes. No return call. Protocol in these situations was clear. If no one was available to receive a delivery, Robert should reschedule it. But he was already at the location. The cargo was loaded near his trailer doors, and the building's dock door was partially open, raised about 3 feet off the ground. Robert decided to take a look. Maybe someone was inside and just hadn't heard their phone. It would save him a trip back tomorrow. He backed his trailer up to the dock, feeling the satisfying thump as his bumper made contact. He set his air brakes, grabbed his handcart, and lowered his trailer's liftgate. Then he walked over to the partially open dock door and ducked underneath it, calling out, "Hello? FedEx freight delivery." His voice echoed in the cavernous space beyond the door. Robert waited for a response. None came. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it into the warehouse. The interior was enormous, stretching back at least 200 feet into darkness. Old shelving units lined the walls, most empty, a few holding cardboard boxes coated in decades of dust. The concrete floor showed cracks and stains. The place smelled of mildew and decay, clearly abandoned for years. This couldn't be right. No active business operated out of this building. Robert pulled out his phone to check the delivery address again, but his signal had dropped to 0 bars. He tried to load the manifest from his company's app, but without signal, the app wouldn't refresh. He was about to leave when he noticed something. Near the back of the warehouse, almost lost in the shadows, was a desk with a lamp. And the lamp was on, casting a small circle of yellowish light in the darkness. Someone was here after all. Robert walked deeper into the warehouse, his footsteps echoing oddly in the empty space. "Hello? Anyone here? I've got a delivery for WM Enterprises." The lamp illuminated a small area, the desk, a filing cabinet, a chair. As Robert approached, he could see papers spread across the desk surface, as if someone had been working there recently. But there was no one present. That was when he noticed the papers themselves. They were forms, printed on old-fashioned green bar computer paper, the kind that fed through continuous printers in the 1980s. Robert picked one up and examined it in the lamplight. It was a shipping manifest. His shipping manifest. Not a copy, but the actual manifest from his truck, showing all 17 deliveries, including this one. But that was impossible. His manifest was in his truck, in the folder in his cab. He'd been holding it less than 5 minutes ago. Robert's stomach tightened. He looked at the other papers on the desk. More manifests, dozens of them, each from different drivers, different companies, different dates spanning decades. Some were so old the paper had yellowed and become brittle. One caught his eye because the date was recent, September 3rd, 2023. Just 2 months ago. The manifest showed deliveries from a driver named Thomas Garrett, working for a company called Daylight Transport. The delivery address was the same as Robert's. 2847 Desolation Road, Winnemucca, Nevada. Robert pulled out his phone again, hoping for signal. Still nothing. But he opened his photo gallery and started photographing the manifests on the desk, some instinct telling him to document everything. That's when he heard the sound. It came from deeper in the warehouse, beyond where the lamplight reached. A mechanical sound, rhythmic and steady. Like a conveyor belt or assembly line, machinery operating in the darkness. "Hello?" Robert called out, his voice less confident now. "I've got your delivery out front, 47 boxes. You want me to leave them on the dock?" The mechanical sound continued, unchanged by his voice. And beneath it, Robert heard something else. Voices. Multiple voices, speaking in low tones, discussing something he couldn't quite make out. He moved toward the sound, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dusty air. The warehouse seemed larger the deeper he went, as if the back wall was receding before him. That wasn't possible, but Robert's eyes insisted it was true. The voices grew louder. He could almost make out words now, fragments of conversation. Wrong address. Never should have stopped. Can't leave. None of us can leave. Robert's flashlight beam found the source of the mechanical sound. It was a conveyor belt, ancient and rusted but running steadily, carrying boxes into darkness. The boxes looked old, their cardboard deteriorating, their labels faded beyond reading. But they kept moving one after another, disappearing into shadows that Robert's flashlight couldn't penetrate. Then he saw the people. They stood alongside the conveyor belt, at least a dozen figures, all wearing delivery company uniforms from different eras. One man wore the brown uniform of UPS, but a style that hadn't been used since the 1970s. A woman wore a Federal Express jumpsuit from the 1980s. Another man wore overalls with Railway Express Agency embroidered on the back, a company that had gone out of business in 1975. They were all working, loading boxes onto the conveyor belt, checking manifests, moving with the mechanical efficiency of experienced delivery drivers. But their movements were wrong somehow. Too smooth, too repetitive, like animatronics in a theme park ride. And none of them acknowledged Robert's presence, even though his flashlight beam was sweeping across them. "Hey!" Robert shouted. "What is this place? What's going on?" The workers continued their tasks without pausing or looking up. One man walked right past Robert, carrying a box so close that Robert could have reached out and touched him. But Robert didn't touch him because the man's eyes were wrong. Flat and empty, reflecting the flashlight beam like animal eyes in headlights. Robert backed away, his heart hammering. This was wrong. All of it wrong. He needed to get out, get back to his truck, leave this place. He turned to retrace his steps and found that the warehouse had changed. The door he'd entered through was no longer visible. The lamplight from the desk had disappeared. His flashlight beam showed only rows of shelving stretching in all directions, creating a maze where moments ago there had been an open path. "No, no, no," Robert muttered, spinning in circles, trying to orient himself. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "It's very real," a voice said behind him. Robert spun around, his flashlight finding a man standing a few feet away. The man wore a FedEx uniform identical to Robert's own, but the style was from the early 1990s when the company was still called Federal Express. The man's name tag read Thomas, and Robert remembered Thomas Garrett, the manifest from September. "You're him," Robert said, "the driver from 2 months ago." Thomas nodded slowly. "I made the same mistake you did. Stopped at the wrong address, came inside looking for someone to sign for my delivery, been here ever since." "That's insane. You can just leave. Walk out." "Can I?" Thomas gestured around them. "Which direction is out, Robert? You've been here 5 minutes and you're already lost. I've been here 2 months and I'm more lost than you can imagine." "How do you know my name?" "Your manifest is on the desk, same as mine. Same as all of theirs." Thomas pointed toward the conveyor belt and the working figures. "We all came to deliver to 2847 Desolation Road. None of us ever left." Robert's mind raced. "There has to be a way out. I'll call for help." He pulled out his phone, but Thomas shook his head. "No signal. There's never any signal. Even if there was, who would you call? Police?" "Hi, I'm lost in a warehouse that shouldn't exist? They'd think you were crazy." "Then I'll find my own way out." Robert pushed past Thomas and started walking, following the shelving rows, searching for the exterior wall. He walked for what felt like 10 minutes, his flashlight beam showing nothing but endless rows of industrial shelving, most empty. Some holding boxes that looked like they'd been there for decades. He came upon another worker, this one a woman in a DHL uniform. She was loading boxes onto a pallet, moving with that same mechanical efficiency. Robert grabbed her shoulder. "Hey, which way to the exit?" The woman didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his touch. She simply continued her work as if Robert didn't exist. Robert released her and kept moving, panic rising in his chest. He had to find the exit. He had 12 more deliveries to make, a schedule to keep. He couldn't be trapped in some impossible warehouse. He found the desk again, still illuminated by that lonely lamp. His manifest was there, on top of the pile, and Robert noticed something that made his blood run cold. Someone had stamped it with a red rubber stamp. Delivered! But he hadn't delivered anything. He hadn't even unloaded his truck. Robert looked at the other manifests, hundreds of them spanning decades. Every single one bore the same red stamp. Delivered! Understanding crashed over him like a physical weight. The cargo, the drivers, the deliveries, they had all been received. Not by a company or a person, but by the warehouse itself. This place collected things. Drivers who stopped at the wrong address, who made the mistake of coming inside, became part of its permanent inventory. "No," Robert said aloud, his voice shaking. "I'm not staying here. I'm leaving." He picked a direction at random and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He ran past shelving, past boxes, past workers who never looked up from their eternal tasks. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached, and when he finally stopped, gasping for breath, he was still surrounded by the same shelving, the same dusty warehouse floor, the same impossible maze. Time lost meaning. Robert might have been running for minutes or hours. The warehouse had no clocks, no windows, no way to mark the passage of time. The only constant was the mechanical sound of the conveyor belt and the shuffling footsteps of the workers. Eventually exhausted, Robert sank to the floor beside a shelving unit. He pulled out his phone, battery at 63%, still no signal, and looked at the photos he'd taken. The manifests, evidence that other drivers had been trapped here before him. He noticed Thomas Garrett's manifest showed a cell phone number. Robert tried calling it, even though he had no signal. The call didn't connect, but Robert's phone vibrated with an incoming text message from Thomas. "Don't give up. There's a pattern. The warehouse changes, but it follows rules. Watch the workers. They know something." Robert looked around wildly. Thomas was nowhere in sight, but the message was real, displayed on his phone screen. "Robert, what pattern? Help me." Thomas. "The workers always face the same direction when they rest. Find where they're looking." Robert stood up and began observing the workers. Most were in constant motion, but occasionally one would pause, standing idle for a moment between tasks. And Thomas was right. When they paused, they always faced the same direction. Southwest by Robert's internal compass. He started walking southwest, following the workers' gaze. The shelving rows seemed to thin out, the clutter decreasing. After what felt like an hour of walking, Robert saw light ahead. Not the artificial lamplight from the desk, but natural light, sunlight streaming through gaps in a wall, the exterior wall. Finally. Robert ran toward it, his heart soaring with hope. He found a door, old and rusted, but a door nonetheless. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened with a shriek of protesting metal, and bright Nevada sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding him. Robert stumbled outside and found himself at the back of the warehouse, in an empty lot filled with weeds and debris. His truck was visible around the corner of the building, still parked at the loading dock, exactly where he'd left it. He ran to his truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. The dash clock showed he'd been inside for 17 minutes, though it had felt like hours. His phone signal returned instantly, full bars. Robert didn't unload the boxes. He didn't try to call the consignee again. He simply released his air brakes and drove away from 2847 Desolation Road as fast as his fully loaded truck would go. He called his dispatcher from the highway and reported the delivery as unable to complete, unsafe location. He took a penalty on his performance metrics and didn't care. He completed his remaining deliveries, then drove straight back to Sacramento and filed a detailed incident report. FedEx sent another driver to attempt the delivery 3 days later. That driver reported the address didn't exist. The building at 2847 Desolation Road was completely abandoned, with no loading dock, no partially open door, no interior warehouse space. Just an empty brick shell scheduled for demolition. Robert requested reassignment to local routes only, no more long-haul work. The company granted his request, figuring he was burned out from the road. They never saw his photos of the manifests, never knew about Thomas Garrett or the dozens of other drivers whose names appeared on those old shipping documents. Robert still drives for FedEx, but only within a 50-mile radius of Sacramento. He never accepts deliveries to addresses he can't verify online first, and he never ever goes inside a building when no one answers his calls, no matter how convenient it might seem. Because Robert knows the truth that most delivery drivers never learn. Some addresses aren't destinations at all, but traps. And some warehouses aren't buildings, but something else entirely. Something that waits patiently for drivers to make one small mistake, to stop at the wrong location, to cross the threshold from the normal world into a place where deliveries are never completed and drivers never leave. Sometimes, late at night, Robert's phone buzzes with text messages from numbers he doesn't recognize. They're always the same. Wrong address, wrong delivery, wrong choice. Now we're all here forever. Robert deletes the messages and tries not to think about Thomas Garrett and all the others, still working in that impossible warehouse, still loading boxes onto that endless conveyor belt, still waiting for someone to find the pattern and help them escape. But Robert knows he can't help them. He barely escaped himself, and some prisons once entered can never truly be left behind. Story 4. The Highway That Shouldn't Exist. Dennis Murphy had been an owner-operator for 23 years, running his own Kenworth T680 on whatever loads paid well enough to cover his operating costs and leave a decent profit. At 56 years old, he'd driven through 48 states, crossed the Canadian border more times than he could count, and developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the North American highway system. He could navigate by road numbers without GPS, knew which rest stops had the best food and cleanliest facilities, and could identify what state he was in just by the highway maintenance quality and signage style. That intimate knowledge made what happened in rural Montana both impossible and undeniable. The load was straightforward: agricultural equipment from Minneapolis to Great Falls, Montana, 23,000 pounds of tractor parts and irrigation system components. The route was equally straightforward: I-94 west across North Dakota, then Highway 200 across Montana. Dennis had driven it at least 30 times before, knew every turn and grade, every small town and fuel stop. It was an easy run, the kind of bread-and-butter work that paid the bills without drama. He left Minneapolis on a Thursday morning, making good time across North Dakota through the afternoon. By early evening, he'd crossed into Montana and was heading west on Highway 200, watching the landscape transition from plains to the scattered foothills that preceded the Rocky Mountains. The weather was perfect: clear skies, no wind, temperature in the low 60s. Classic late September in Montana, the kind of driving weather that made Dennis grateful he'd chosen this profession. He'd been on Highway 200 for about 2 hours when he noticed the road sign. Alternate Route 200A, Lewistown 47 miles. Dennis frowned. He'd never seen that sign before, and he'd driven this highway dozens of times. Montana did have alternate routes, usually older highway alignments that had been bypassed by newer construction, but he'd never heard of 200A. His curiosity piqued. He slowed down to get a better look at the sign. It appeared legitimate: standard green highway sign, proper reflective coating, Montana Department of Transportation styling. The sign indicated an exit half a mile ahead. Dennis checked his GPS, which showed him on Highway 200 with no mention of any alternate route. But GPS databases weren't always current with every minor road designation. The exit appeared right where the sign promised. It was a standard highway off-ramp, well-maintained pavement, proper striping. Another sign at the ramp entrance read, Alternate 200A, Scenic Route, Lewistown 47 miles. Dennis made a split-second decision. He was ahead of schedule, had plenty of fuel, and had never explored this particular alternate route. Why not see some new scenery? Montana was beautiful in September, and scenic routes often provided views that the main highways missed. He took the exit. The alternate highway was 2 lanes, well-maintained, with fresh center line and edge striping. It curved away from Highway 200, heading northwest through rolling hills covered in pine trees and autumn gold aspens. Dennis saw no other traffic, which wasn't surprising. Alternate routes typically carried very light traffic, mostly locals who knew the area. The road climbed gradually into the hills, offering occasional views of the surrounding landscape. Dennis enjoyed the change of pace, the twisting road requiring more attention than the straight main highway. His truck handled the curves easily, the load well balanced and stable. He'd been driving on 200A for about 20 minutes when he noticed something odd. There were no driveways, no ranch gates, no side roads, just unbroken wilderness on both sides of the highway. That was unusual. Montana ranches were large, but you typically saw access points every few miles at minimum. This road showed no evidence of human presence beyond its own existence. His CB radio was silent too. Dennis tried several channels, calling out for radio checks. Nothing but static answered him. That could mean he was in a dead zone, surrounded by terrain that blocked radio signals. But he'd never encountered a dead zone that persisted for this long on a major alternate route. The sun was setting now, long shadows stretching across the highway. Dennis checked his GPS. The screen showed him still on Highway 200, with no indication he'd ever exited or changed routes. That was concerning. He should show up on 200A by now. He tried zooming out on the GPS, searching for his location from a wider perspective. The GPS showed him driving through empty space, his truck icon crawling across terrain where no road existed. Dennis felt the first flutter of anxiety. GPS glitches happened, but this was extreme. He looked at his odometer. He'd traveled 31 miles since taking the exit. According to the sign, Lewistown was 47 miles from the exit point, meaning he should be seeing signs for the town soon, maybe some outlying ranches or businesses. Instead, the wilderness around him grew denser. The pine forest pressed closer to the highway, the undergrowth thick and shadowed. The aspens had disappeared, replaced by dark evergreens that absorbed the fading daylight. A road sign appeared in his headlights. Lewistown, 16 miles. The math didn't work. He'd driven 31 miles, which should have left 16 miles to go, exactly as the sign indicated. But that meant the sign at the entrance had been accurate. So why did his GPS show him driving through non-existent terrain? Dennis drove on, discomfort growing into genuine worry. The highway continued to twist through increasingly dense forest, no longer offering views of surrounding landscape. The trees formed walls on both sides, their branches sometimes reaching over the road to create a tunnel effect. No buildings, no intersections, no mile markers, just endless asphalt and encroaching wilderness. Another sign, Lewistown, 16 miles. Dennis's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd just driven several miles, but the distance to Lewistown hadn't changed. That was impossible. He checked his speedometer, 53 miles per hour, his standard cruising speed on 2-lane roads. He checked his odometer. It had advanced 5 miles since the last Lewistown sign. Everything about his truck insisted he was moving forward, covering distance normally. But the signs told a different story. He tried his cell phone, no signal. He tried his satellite radio, no signal. He tried his CB again, cycling through all 40 channels, static on every frequency. The sun had fully set now, leaving only his headlights to illuminate the highway. The pine forests on both sides had become solid walls of darkness, impenetrable to his vision. Dennis couldn't see anything beyond the road itself. No sky, no horizon, no landmarks, just the highway stretching ahead into darkness and trees pressing in from all sides. Another sign appeared. Lewistown, 16 miles. Dennis cursed aloud. This was wrong, deeply wrong. Highways didn't repeat distances like this. Roads didn't refuse to consume miles no matter how far you drove. He'd somehow left normal space and entered something else, somewhere else. He considered turning around, but the highway offered no turnaround points. The road was only wide enough for 2 lanes with no shoulders, no pullouts, no areas where he could safely reverse a 53-foot truck. He could only continue forward and hope that Lewistown actually existed at the end of this impossible highway. Then the road began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the pavement started to deteriorate. The smooth asphalt developed cracks, then potholes, then entire sections where the surface had crumbled away. Dennis had to slow down, weaving to avoid the worst damage. His headlights revealed pavement that looked decades old, weather-worn and neglected, as if the road was aging as he drove. The center line and edge stripes faded, then disappeared completely. The road narrowed, shrinking from 2 full lanes to barely 1.5. The trees pressed even closer, branches scraping against Dennis's trailer as he drove, leaving scratches on the metal sides. Another sign appeared, but this one was different. It was older, the green paint faded to gray, the reflective coating mostly gone. The text was still readable. Lewistown, 16 miles. Dennis felt ice in his stomach. The highway was decaying around him, transforming from a modern alternate route into something ancient and forgotten. But it still insisted that Lewistown was 16 miles away, no matter how far he drove. The trees began to change too. The pines gave way to something else, species Dennis didn't recognize. The bark was too dark, almost black, and the branches twisted in ways that seemed geometrically wrong. The trees' silhouettes in his headlights resembled clutching hands more than natural growth patterns. His truck's engine sound changed, developing a slight knocking that hadn't been there before. Dennis checked his gauges, oil pressure, temperature, all normal. But the knock persisted, growing gradually louder with each passing mile. The highway surface continued deteriorating. Large sections of pavement were simply gone now, replaced by packed dirt or gravel. Dennis's speed dropped to 30 miles per hour, then 20, as he navigated increasingly rough terrain. This wasn't a highway anymore. It was barely a logging road, carved through forests that should have reclaimed it decades ago. Another sign, this one barely standing, leaning at a dangerous angle. Lewistown, 16 miles. Dennis made a decision. At the next possible opportunity, he would stop, turn his truck around regardless of the difficulty, and drive back the way he'd come. This road led nowhere good, and continuing forward was foolish. But the highway offered no place to turn around. The trees had closed in until they formed an unbroken wall inches from his mirrors. He could only continue forward, trapped in a corridor of impossible vegetation and decaying road. His headlights began to dim. Dennis checked his electrical system. Battery voltage was fine, alternator charging normally. But the headlights continued fading, as if the darkness around him was somehow consuming the light. Within minutes, his visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Through the failing headlights, Dennis saw something ahead. A building, finally, emerging from the forest. As he drew closer, hope turned to confusion, then horror. It was a gas station, but abandoned, windows broken, roof caving in. Rust-covered pumps stood like skeletal sentinels. A faded sign hung crooked from a post. Last fuel before Lewistown, 16 miles. Dennis drove past the ruined station, his truck bouncing over potholes that were more crater than pothole. The knocking in his engine grew louder, now accompanied by grinding sounds that suggested serious mechanical damage. His transmission started slipping, struggling to maintain power to the wheels. He wasn't going to make it. Whatever Lewistown had become in this impossible version of Montana, Dennis would never reach it. His truck was failing, the road was disappearing, and the forest was closing in. Then, as suddenly as entering a tunnel, Dennis drove out of the trees. The highway surface smoothed instantly. His headlights brightened to full power. The knocking and grinding sounds ceased. Dennis found himself on a modern, well-maintained two-lane highway with proper striping and fresh pavement. A road sign appeared on his right. Highway 200, 1 mile. Dennis nearly sobbed with relief. He'd somehow reconnected with the main highway. Whatever nightmare alternate route he'd been on had released him back to normal reality. He drove the mile to Highway 200 and found the intersection, a sign pointing back the direction he'd come read. Alternate route 200A closed, bridge out. Dennis pulled onto Highway 200 and stopped on the shoulder, hands shaking too badly to continue driving. He checked his GPS. It showed him exactly where he should be, having apparently covered the expected distance to this point. His odometer confirmed it. But Dennis had experienced nearly 2 hours of driving on that impossible highway, and his truck's clock showed only 30 minutes had elapsed since he'd taken the exit. He climbed out of his cab and walked around his truck, examining it. The sides of his trailer bore deep scratches from the tree branches, long gouges in the metal that would need professional repair. His tires showed excessive wear, the tread depth noticeably reduced. His truck had physically experienced the journey through that nightmare highway, even if time disagreed. Dennis climbed back into his cab and pulled out his atlas, the old-fashioned paper kind that he'd always carried as a backup to GPS. He searched for any mention of alternate route 200A. Nothing, no indication that such a road had ever existed. He called his wife, relieved when she answered after 2 rings. "Hey, honey, just checking in. I'm in Montana, about an hour from Great Falls." "You sound shaken," his wife said immediately. "What happened?" Dennis considered telling her the truth, then realized he couldn't. "How do you explain that you'd driven on a highway that didn't exist, through a forest that aged around you, toward a town permanently fixed 16 miles away? How do you convey the horror of being trapped on a road that consumed distance without covering it? That decay in real time that led only deeper into impossible darkness." "Just tired," Dennis lied. "Long day on the road. I'll call you when I reach Great Falls." He ended the call and sat in his truck for another 10 minutes, gathering himself. Then he pulled back onto Highway 200 and drove the remaining distance to Great Falls without incident, delivered his load, and immediately headed back toward Minneapolis without accepting another westbound load. Dennis never drove Highway 200 through Montana again. He altered his routes to avoid it entirely, adding hours to his trips, burning extra fuel, but refusing to risk encountering that exit again. When other drivers asked why, he just said he preferred different scenery, left it at that. But Dennis knows what he experienced. He knows that somewhere off Highway 200 there's an exit to a road that shouldn't exist, an alternate route that leads only to decay and darkness and distance that can never be crossed. He knows that Lewistown, whatever it had been, waits at the end of that highway, forever 16 miles away from travelers who make the mistake of taking that exit. Sometimes when Dennis is driving other highways in other states, he sees road signs for alternate routes he doesn't recognize. His hands tighten on the wheel and he drives past without slowing, refusing to be tempted by curiosity again. Because he knows now that not every highway on the map leads where it claims to go, and some roads once taken can never truly be left behind. The scratches on his trailer remain, permanent reminders of the trees that shouldn't have existed. And late at night, when Dennis can't sleep, he sometimes hears an echo of that engine knock, that grinding transmission. and he wonders how many other drivers have taken that exit, driven that impossible highway, and never found their way back to the real Highway 200. Story 5. The Fuel Stop. Caroline Briggs had been driving team with her husband Marcus for 6 years, running coast-to-coast loads that required 2 drivers to maximize driving time and minimize delivery delays. At 32 years old, Caroline had logged over 600,000 miles, and she and Marcus had developed the kind of silent communication that made them an efficient team. They knew each other's driving styles, sleeping patterns, and quirks well enough that they could swap driving duties with minimal disruption. That teamwork made what happened at the fuel stop in rural New Mexico all the more tragic. The load was pharmaceutical supplies from New Jersey to Phoenix, high-value cargo that required both security and speed. Caroline and Marcus had been driving for 3 days straight, rotating shifts every 4 hours, making excellent time across the country. They'd crossed into New Mexico on I-40, heading west through the high desert, when Marcus announced they needed fuel. "Next exit," Marcus said from the driver's seat. Caroline was in the sleeper berth, not quite asleep but dozing lightly. Flying J in 15 miles. But 15 miles later they found the Flying J closed. Not just closed for the night, but permanently shut down, windows boarded up, parking lot empty. Marcus cursed softly. Their fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, maybe 150 miles of range remaining. They needed to fuel soon or risk getting stranded. Caroline climbed into the front passenger seat and checked their GPS. "Next truck stop is over 200 miles. We're not going to make it." "There," Marcus pointed to a sign ahead. "Last fuel, exit 167, 2 miles. The exit led to a 2-lane road that headed south into empty desert. After a mile, they saw lights ahead. A fuel station, small and isolated, but definitely open. Old-fashioned pumps glowed under harsh fluorescent lights, and a small building served as the station office. A weathered sign read, "Desert Star Fuel, last stop for 200 miles. Marcus pulled their truck up to the pumps, which were surprisingly modern despite the station's aged appearance. He climbed out to begin fueling while Caroline remained in the cab, reviewing their route and making notes in their logbook. Through the windshield, Caroline watched Marcus swipe his fuel card and begin the fueling process. Then she noticed something odd. The station appeared completely unstaffed. No clerk visible in the office, no other customers, no vehicles except their truck. The lights were on, the pumps operational, but the place felt abandoned despite its functioning systems. Marcus finished fueling. It took nearly 15 minutes to fill their dual tanks and headed toward the office to get a receipt. Caroline watched him enter the building, then turned her attention back to her logbook. 5 minutes passed. Marcus didn't return. Caroline felt the first hint of unease. Getting a receipt shouldn't take 5 minutes. She looked toward the office. The lights were on, but she couldn't see Marcus through the windows. The glass appeared dark, reflective, showing only the surrounding desert night. 10 minutes. Caroline's unease transformed into worry. She grabbed her phone and called Marcus. The call went directly to voicemail, which was strange. Marcus always kept his phone on while they were working. 15 minutes. Something was wrong. Caroline climbed out of the truck and walked toward the office, her boots crunching on gravel. The night was utterly silent, no traffic sounds, no wind, no insects. Just oppressive desert silence broken only by her footsteps. The office door was propped open. Caroline pushed it wider and stepped inside. "Marcus?" The interior was sparse. A counter, a cash register, a few shelves displaying overpriced snacks and drinks. No Marcus, no clerk, no one at all. A door behind the counter presumably led to a back room or office. Caroline walked around the counter and tried the door. Unlocked. She pushed it open and found a small break room. Table, chairs, old coffee maker. Still no Marcus. "Marcus!" Caroline called out louder now. Her voice echoed strangely in the small space, as if the walls were absorbing sound rather than reflecting it. She pulled out her phone to call 911, but there was no signal. The screen showed 0 bars, no network connection at all. That was unusual but not unheard of in rural New Mexico. She'd have to drive to the main highway and find a signal there. Caroline returned to the truck, growing more frightened by the second. Where was Marcus? He couldn't have just disappeared. There was nowhere to go from this fuel station except back to the truck or into empty desert. She sat in the driver's seat and started the engine, intending to drive back to I-40 and call police. But as her headlights illuminated the fuel station, Caroline saw something that made her heart stop. There were 2 figures standing by the pumps now. Marcus and someone else, a man wearing what looked like a service station uniform. They appeared to be having a conversation, Marcus gesturing toward the truck, the other man nodding. Caroline jumped out of the cab. "Marcus, where have you been? I've been looking." She stopped mid-sentence because something was terribly wrong with Marcus. He looked normal at first glance, same height, same build, same clothing. But his movements were off, too smooth, too fluid, lacking the small hesitations and natural rhythms that characterized human motion. And his eyes, when he turned to look at Caroline, were completely black. No whites, no irises, just solid darkness that reflected the fluorescent lights like polished stones. "Ready to go," Not Marcus said, his voice almost but not quite matching Marcus's natural tone. "Everything's paid for." Caroline backed away, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This thing wasn't her husband. It looked like Marcus, sounded like Marcus, wore Marcus's clothes, but it wasn't him. Couldn't be him. "Where's my husband?" Caroline demanded, her voice cracking. "What did you do with Marcus?" The man in the service station uniform smiled, an expression that showed too many teeth. "Your husband is exactly where he needs to be. And so are you. This is the last stop, after all." "The last stop for what?" "For everyone who fuels here. Everyone who makes the mistake of stopping at exit 167. The man's smile widened impossibly, his mouth stretching beyond normal human dimensions. "We provide a service, you see. We keep the pumps running, the lights on. And in exchange, we require payment. Not money. We have no use for money. We require something more substantial." Caroline's hand found the handle of her folding knife, which she always carried on her belt. "I want my husband back. Now." "Your husband agreed to the exchange," the man said. "He signed the receipt. Binding contracts, receipts. Very official." Not Marcus took a step toward Caroline. "We should go now. Phoenix is waiting." "You're not Marcus!" Caroline screamed, brandishing the knife. "Stay away from me!" The thing that looked like her husband stopped, its head tilting at an angle that was just slightly wrong. "I am Marcus now. He traded places. He's inside now and I'm outside. Fair exchange." Inside. The word clicked in Caroline's mind. Marcus was inside the station somewhere. He had to be. She'd looked in the office and break room, but there must be other spaces, a basement, a storage area, somewhere she hadn't checked. Caroline ran back toward the office, ignoring the shouts from Not Marcus and the service station man. She burst through the door and looked around frantically. There, a second door she'd missed before, so perfectly flush with the wall that it was nearly invisible. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Stairs led down into darkness. Caroline descended without hesitation, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the way. The stairs went down much farther than should have been possible. The station office was a small, single-story building, but these stairs descended at least 30 feet before reaching a concrete floor. The basement was enormous, stretching far beyond the station's footprint above. It was filled with people. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, standing in perfect rows like mannequins in a store. They were all dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans, work shirts, dresses, business suits, all standing motionless, eyes closed, barely breathing. Caroline walked among them, her flashlight beam sweeping across face after face. They all looked asleep, trapped in some kind of suspended animation. She recognized clothing styles from different eras, some wearing fashions from the 1980s, others from decades earlier. How long had this place been operating? Then she found him. Marcus, standing in the second row, eyes closed, perfectly still. Caroline grabbed his shoulders and shook him. "Marcus, wake up, we need to go." Marcus's eyes didn't open. He didn't respond to her shaking or shouting. He just stood there, breathing slowly, lost in whatever nightmare held him. Caroline heard footsteps on the stairs behind her. The service station man was coming, along with not Marcus and possibly others. She had seconds to act. She did the only thing she could think of. She stabbed her knife into Marcus's palm, driving the blade through his hand. The pain should have woken him, should have shocked him back to consciousness. Marcus's eyes snapped open and he screamed. The sound echoed through the massive basement, and suddenly all the other people began moving, their eyes opening, confused voices rising in a cacophony of overlapping questions and shouts. "Run!" Caroline grabbed Marcus's uninjured hand and pulled him toward the stairs. Behind them, the basement descended into chaos as dozens of sleepers awakened simultaneously, disoriented and panicking. They ran up the stairs, Caroline in the lead, Marcus stumbling behind her, clutching his bleeding hand. They emerged into the office to find not Marcus and the service station man blocking the exit. But the two figures looked different now. Less solid, flickering like television static, as if they were losing their hold on physical reality. "You broke the contract," the service station man shrieked, his voice distorting into something inhuman. "You can't break the contract." Caroline didn't stop running. She lowered her shoulder and charged straight through not Marcus, which dissolved like smoke upon contact. The service station man tried to grab her, but his fingers passed through her arm as if he were a ghost. Caroline and Marcus burst out of the office and ran to their truck. Caroline jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the accelerator before Marcus had even closed his door. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel, and she aimed for the access road that led back to the highway. In the mirrors, Caroline saw the fuel station flickering, its lights dimming and brightening erratically. The building itself seemed to be losing definition, its edges blurring. And around it, people were emerging from the office, the sleepers from the basement, stumbling into the desert night, free from whatever force had held them. Caroline drove back to I-40 at dangerous speed, her hands shaking on the wheel. Marcus sat beside her, cradling his injured hand, blood soaking through the shirt he'd wrapped around the wound. Neither of them spoke until they reached the main highway and found a legitimate truck stop 20 miles west. In the truck stop parking lot, Caroline bandaged Marcus's hand properly while he explained what had happened. He'd entered the office to get a receipt. The service station clerk had been friendly, normal. He'd filled out the receipt. Marcus had signed it without reading the fine print. And the moment his signature touched paper, everything had changed. The clerk had smiled, that too wide smile, and Marcus had felt himself falling, sinking into something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite unconsciousness. He dreamed of standing in darkness, surrounded by others who stood just as still and silent, trapped in a place that felt like it existed outside of time. Then pain, sharp, sudden, shocking, had ripped through his hand, and he'd awakened to find Caroline pulling him upstairs he didn't remember descending. They called 911 from the truck stop, reporting what they'd found. The state police took their report but seemed skeptical, especially when Caroline mentioned the basement full of people and the figures that looked human but weren't. Still, the police promised to investigate. Caroline and Marcus sat in their truck, drinking coffee from the truck stop, waiting for dawn. Neither could face driving through darkness yet. When the sun finally rose, they completed their delivery to Phoenix, then immediately drove back to New Jersey without accepting any return loads. They learned later that police had investigated exit 167. They'd found the access road and followed it, but discovered no fuel station, no building, no evidence that any structure had ever existed at that location. Just empty desert and rocks. The police wrote it off as a case of exhausted drivers hallucinating after too many hours on the road. But Caroline knew better. She had the scratches on her arms from running through the office door. Marcus had the knife wound in his palm requiring 12 stitches to close. Their truck's GPS showed that they'd stopped at exit 167 for over an hour. Time that had passed in normal reality, even if the place they'd stopped shouldn't have existed. Caroline and Marcus quit team driving after that. They couldn't handle the isolation of long-distance loads anymore, the lonely stretches of highway where fuel stops might not be what they appeared. They both took local jobs driving delivery routes, home every night, never traveling more than 100 miles from their house. They never spoke about what happened at the Desert Star Fuel. They didn't need to. They both knew they'd encountered something that waited in the empty spaces between cities, something that lured travelers with the promise of fuel and convenience, then trapped them in a nightmare that could last decades or longer. Sometimes late at night, Marcus wakes up screaming from nightmares about standing in darkness surrounded by silent sleepers, and Caroline holds him until the fear passes. Sometimes when Caroline is driving and sees an isolated fuel station, her hands shake on the wheel and she drives past, even if her fuel gauge is low, because she knows that some stops aren't worth the risk. The scar on Marcus's palm remains, a permanent reminder of the knife wound that saved him. He tells people it was a work accident, and they believe him because the truth is too strange to credit. But Caroline sees him touch the scar sometimes, absently tracing the line of stitched tissue, and she knows he's remembering the same thing she is. The fuel station that shouldn't have existed, the basement full of sleepers, and the thing that wore his face and tried to take his place in the truck, in his life, in reality itself. They still drive trucks. They still make deliveries and earn their living on the road. But they're more careful now, more selective about where they stop, more aware that the highway system includes places that aren't marked on any map and shouldn't exist in any rational world. And they know that exit 167 or something like it is still out there, waiting for the next travelers who need fuel badly enough to ignore their instincts and pull off the highway to a place called the last stop. Because that's what it really is, the last stop for anyone who makes the mistake of fueling there. And if Caroline hadn't broken the contract, hadn't awakened Marcus from that nightmare basement, he would still be standing there now, eyes closed, breathing slowly, trapped forever in a place that exists in the gaps between reality and nightmare, where fuel stops never close and payment is always extracted one way or another. I'll continue with Story 6. Story 6. The Voice on the CB. Raymond Ray Foster had been hauling logs across the Pacific Northwest for 19 years, operating his own Peterbilt 389 on routes that wound through Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. At 47 years old, he'd developed a deep appreciation for the forests he worked in, understanding their moods and dangers better than most people who'd spent their entire lives in the region. He knew when the Douglas firs whispered warnings of storms, when the fog that rolled through the valleys would clear, and which logging roads required chains even when the weather report called for dry conditions. That knowledge made him confident. Maybe too confident, which is why what happened on the Harrison Creek logging road shattered his understanding of both the forest and reality itself. The load was standard, 40,000 pounds of Douglas fir logs, cut from a sustainable harvest unit in the Cascade foothills, bound for a mill in Eugene. Ray had driven the Harrison Creek route dozens of times, knew every curve and grade, every washout and rough patch. It was a challenging drive, 15 miles of narrow gravel logging road with steep grades and sharp switchbacks. But Ray enjoyed the challenge. Logging roads kept his skills sharp in ways that highway driving never could. He started the run at 2 a.m., his standard time for moving through the mountains. Night driving on logging roads was safer in some ways. No other traffic to worry about, no conflicts with log trucks coming the opposite direction. Ray's headlights and his knowledge of the route were all he needed. The CB radio crackled as he started up the mountain. Ray kept it on out of habit, even though traffic was unlikely at this hour. The CB provided a sense of connection, a reminder that other drivers existed even when you couldn't see them. 20 minutes into the drive, climbing through the second series of switchbacks, a voice emerged from the CB's static. "Northbound logger on Harrison Creek. This is southbound logger at mile marker 7. You got a copy?" Ray grabbed his mic. "Copy that, southbound. This is northbound at mile marker 3. I'll be at 7 in about 20 minutes. You want to meet at the turnout at marker 5? Standard procedure when two trucks needed to pass on a narrow logging road. Meet at a designated turnout. One truck pulls off, the other passes safely." Mile marker 5 had a good pullout, wide enough for Ray's loaded truck. "Negative," the voice said. "Don't come up to 7, turn around, go back down." Ray frowned. "What's the problem? Washout? Tree down?" "Just turn around," the voice said, and Ray noticed something odd about it. The tone was wrong, too flat, emotionless, and the signal was crystal clear, not the usual static-filled transmission you got in the mountains. "I need more information than that," Ray said. "I've got a deadline on this load. If there's a blockage, I need to call it in, get a crew out to clear it." "Can't be cleared," the voice said. "Not anymore. Been here too long? Turn around while you still can." Ray felt irritation flare. Some drivers enjoyed hazing newer operators with tall tales and pranks, but Ray didn't have time for games. "Look, friend, I've been driving this road for almost 2 decades. I don't know who you are, but I'm not turning around without a reason. If you're really stuck at marker 7, I'll bring chains and a winch. Otherwise, clear the channel." Silence answered him. Ray replaced his mic and continued driving, his headlights cutting through the darkness. Fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to about 100 feet, but that was normal for Harrison Creek in the pre-dawn hours. Ray adjusted his speed, taking the switchbacks carefully, his engine brake grumbling as he controlled his descent on the downhill sections. Mile marker 5 passed on his right. The pullout was empty, no southbound truck waiting. Ray filed that away as confirmation that the CB voice had been playing games. No one was really up here. The fog grew thicker as he climbed higher. Ray's headlights created strange shadows in the murk, making the roadside trees look like they were moving. He'd driven in hundreds of foggy conditions and knew it was just an optical illusion, his brain trying to find patterns in the shifting moisture. Mile marker 6. 1 more mile to wherever the voice had claimed to be calling from. Ray's CB remained silent now, just the soft hiss of empty channels. Then emerging from the fog ahead, Ray saw lights, not headlights, smaller flickering lights at about shoulder height, visible through the trees on the uphill side of the road. Someone was out there in the forest with a flashlight or lantern. Ray slowed to a crawl, searching for the source. The lights moved parallel to the road, keeping pace with his truck, staying about 50 feet off the roadway. That made no sense. Why would someone be hiking through the forest at 3 a.m. in dense fog? His CB crackled to life. "You should have turned around." The voice was the same, but closer now, more present, as if the speaker was nearby rather than transmitting remotely. Ray grabbed his mic. "I see lights in the forest. That you out there? You need help?" "Don't stop," the voice said. "Whatever you do, don't stop. Don't get out of your truck. Just drive. Drive fast." Ray's irritation transformed into unease. The lights in the forest had multiplied. Instead of one flickering light, he now saw dozens spread through the trees, all moving in the same direction, all keeping pace with his truck. And they weren't flashlight beams. They had a sickly yellow-green quality, like bioluminescence, like foxfire on rotting wood. "What are those lights?" Ray asked into his mic. "They're what's left," the voice said. "What's left of everyone who stopped, everyone who got out, everyone who thought they could help." Ray accelerated, his truck's engine roaring as he pushed harder up the grade. The lights stayed with him, matching his increased speed effortlessly. Through the fog, Ray caught glimpses of figures between the trees. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, their proportions distorted, their movements too smooth and gliding. They carried the lights. Or maybe they were the lights. It was impossible to tell through the fog. His headlights found mile marker 7 ahead, and there, pulled off on a small turnout, was a log truck. Ray's headlights swept across it, and his blood ran cold. The truck was old, a 1970s-era Kenworth, the kind that hadn't been in production for 40 years. It was loaded with logs, the chains and binders still in place, everything looking ready to drive. Except the truck was covered in moss and lichen, vegetation growing through the wheel wells, small trees sprouting from the truck's cab. It had been here for years, decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Ray drove past it, his eyes locked on the impossible sight. How could a truck sit here for that long without anyone noticing? The logging company monitored these roads constantly. Equipment didn't just disappear for decades. "You see it now," the voice said from the CB. "My truck. Been here since 1983. I was hauling down the mountain, saw lights in the forest, thought someone needed help. Stopped. Got out. That was my mistake." "This isn't possible," Ray said, but his voice shook. The lights in the forest had grown brighter, closer, pressing in from both sides of the road. Through the fog, Ray could see the figures more clearly now. They had faces, or had once had faces, features that were melted and stretched like wax held too close to flame. And they were reaching toward Ray's truck, their elongated arms stretching across the distance, fingers that had too many joints bending in impossible ways. "Drive faster," the voice urged. "They're waking up. They don't like it when trucks come through anymore. Used to be they'd just watch. But it's been so long since anyone traveled this road at night, they've forgotten how to just watch." Ray stomped on the accelerator, his truck surging forward, engine screaming in protest. His load shifted slightly, the logs groaning against their binders. He was going too fast for the conditions, too fast for the curves ahead, but terror overrode caution. One of the figures broke from the tree line and glided onto the road directly in Ray's path. He had a split second to see it clearly. A man's shape, wearing what might have once been clothing, face twisted into an expression of hunger and longing. Ray swerved, his trailer swinging wide, tires kicking up gravel and dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't dodge. Ray's truck passed through it as if it were smoke, and for a moment Ray felt a cold that went beyond temperature, a chill that seemed to freeze his very thoughts. His CB erupted with voices, not just one now, but dozens, all talking over each other. "Should have stopped, could have helped. Been here so long, so cold. Join us in the trees. Lights go out, we go out." Ray reached over and turned off his CB, cutting the voices to silence. But it didn't help. He could still hear them, faint and distant, coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the cab despite the radio being powered down. Mile marker 8, 9, 10. The lights followed the figures, keeping pace, sometimes appearing directly on the road, forcing Ray to swerve. His headlights showed the road ahead clearly, but everything in his peripheral vision was chaos. Fog and lights and reaching figures that existed in the space between visible and invisible. Then his engine coughed. Ray's heart lurched. No, not now, not here. He checked his gauges. Fuel was fine, oil pressure good, temperature normal. But the engine coughed again, missing a beat, the power dropping for a second before recovering. Something was on his truck. Ray could feel it, a weight that hadn't been there before, pressing down on the cab from above. He heard scratching sounds on the roof like fingernails or claws digging into the metal. The engine died completely. Ray's truck coasted forward, momentum carrying it 100 yards before gravity and friction brought it to a stop. The headlights flickered once, twice, then went out, leaving only the faint glow of the dashboard LEDs. Total silence. The forest had gone quiet. Even the soft hiss of wind through trees had ceased. Ray sat in darkness, his breath coming in short gasps, hands frozen on the steering wheel. Then the lights appeared outside his windows, dozens of them surrounding his truck, pressing close to the glass. And behind the lights, faces, human faces stretched and distorted, eyes that glowed with that same sickly yellow-green luminescence. Ray's door handle began to turn from the outside. He grabbed the handle and held it, fighting against whatever force was trying to open the door. The handle fought back, turning despite his grip, metal warm under his palm, almost hot. Ray braced his feet against the door and pulled with all his strength. "Don't let them in!" The voice from the CB audible despite the radio being off. "Whatever you do, don't let them inside the cab." "What do they want?" Ray shouted into the darkness. "Company," the voice said. "They're lonely. Been lonely for so long they want you to join them, want you to stand in the trees and hold the lights and wait for the next driver. Forever." Ray's muscles burned as he held the door handle. The heat was increasing, the metal becoming painful to touch. But he didn't let go. Couldn't let go. His starter button. If he could reach it, maybe the engine would turn over, maybe he could get power back. Ray stretched his left hand toward the dash while maintaining his death grip on the door handle with his right. His fingers found the button and pressed. Nothing happened. The starter didn't engage, no sound at all. The scratching sounds on his roof grew louder, more frantic. Something was trying to tear through the metal to claw its way inside the cab. Ray could see the cab's ceiling dimpling inward in several places as if invisible hands were pushing down from above. "Your lights!" the CB voice shouted. "Turn on your cabin lights!" Ray released the door handle long enough to slap the overhead light switch. The cabin lights blazed to life, harsh LED brilliance flooding the cab's interior. Instantly, the pressure on his door released. The scratching sound ceased. The figures outside his windows retreated, the lights drawing back into the forest. Ray heard sounds that might have been screaming or might have been wind, high-pitched and agonized. His engine turned over, roaring to life without Ray touching the starter. His headlights came back on, illuminating the road ahead. Everything was suddenly normal, as if the attack had never happened. "Drive!" the voice commanded. "Drive now before they adapt!" Ray didn't need to be told twice. He released his air brakes and accelerated, his truck surging forward. Mile marker 11, 12, 13. The lights in the forest fell behind, unable or unwilling to follow now that Ray's cabin lights were blazing. At mile marker 15, the gravel logging road met pavement. Ray had never been so relieved to feel asphalt beneath his tires. The forest opened up, giving way to cleared land and scattered buildings. Civilization. His CB radio, still turned off, transmitted one final message. "You made it. More than I did. Don't come back here at night, never come back. Some places belong to the dead now, and Harrison Creek is one of them." Ray drove straight to the mill in Eugene and unloaded his cargo. He told the yard supervisor that the Harrison Creek route needed to be closed, that there were hazards on the road. When pressed for details, Ray claimed he'd seen evidence of unstable ground, possible slides. The supervisor made a note in his log but seemed skeptical. Ray never drove Harrison Creek again, not at night, not even during daylight hours. He gave up logging entirely within 3 months, sold his truck, and took a job driving local deliveries. When his logging friends asked why, he just said he was getting too old for the mountain roads, wanted something easier. But Ray knew the truth. He knew that something lived in the forests around Harrison Creek. Something that collected the dead or the lost, turned them into guardians or wardens or prisoners of that stretch of road. He'd seen the 1983 Kenworth still loaded, still waiting after all those years. He'd heard the voice of its driver, trapped somewhere between life and death, able to warn but not to escape. And Ray had felt those hands on his door handle, that weight on his roof, the terrible cold of things that had forgotten what warmth meant. He'd come within seconds of joining them, of becoming another light in the forest, another voice on the CB radio, warning drivers who came after him. Sometimes, late at night, Ray's old CB radio, which he'd stored in his garage never to be used again, crackles to life on its own. He hears voices, dozens of them, talking over each other, sharing their stories of the night they stopped, the night they got out, the night they joined the lights in the forest, and occasionally one voice rises above the others. "Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for driving past. I'm still here. We're all still here, but you got away. Remember that. Remember us." Ray always unplugs the CB after those transmissions, but it doesn't matter. The next night or the night after, it will crackle to life again, powered by something that has nothing to do with electricity, sharing messages from a place where dead loggers still think they're working, still believe they're hauling loads down the mountain, trapped forever on Harrison Creek where the lights never go out and the night never ends. Story 7. The fuel stop that wasn't. Rebecca Torres had been driving long-haul routes for transcontinental freight for 9 years, specializing in time-sensitive pharmaceutical deliveries that required precise temperature control and rigid adherence to schedules. At 34 years old, she was one of the youngest drivers in her company to achieve over 1 million miles without a preventable accident, a distinction that came with both pride and better route assignments. Rebecca's reliability and professionalism were legendary among dispatchers, and she commanded respect in an industry still dominated by men. She kept detailed logs of every journey, maintained her truck meticulously, and never, ever deviated from established protocols. On the night of September 27, 2020, Rebecca was hauling a load of insulin and blood products from Houston to Minneapolis, a route she'd driven at least 40 times before. The cargo was worth over $300,000 and required constant refrigeration at precisely controlled temperatures. Any deviation could render the entire shipment useless. Rebecca's route took her through Oklahoma and Kansas on Highway 35, a stretch of interstate she knew intimately. She timed every fuel stop, planned every rest break, and calculated her arrival to the minute. The evening was unseasonably warm for late September, with temperatures still hovering in the mid-80s even after sunset. Rebecca had departed Houston at 6 p.m., putting her on schedule to reach Minneapolis by the following afternoon with time to spare. She'd already completed her first fuel stop in southern Oklahoma without incident, topping off her tanks and performing a routine check of her refrigeration unit. Everything was functioning perfectly. Her GPS showed her next planned fuel stop at a large truck plaza just north of Wichita, Kansas, approximately 200 miles ahead. Around midnight, as Rebecca crossed into Kansas, her fuel gauge began dropping faster than expected. She'd filled up just 3 hours earlier and should have had plenty of range to reach Wichita. But the needle was already below the halfway mark. Rebecca frowned at the gauge, tapping it gently to see if it was malfunctioning. The needle didn't move. Pulling up her electronic logs, Rebecca confirmed that her fuel consumption rate was nearly double what it should be. Either her gauge was reading incorrectly or her truck had developed a serious fuel leak. Rebecca immediately began scanning for the next available fuel stop. She couldn't risk running out of diesel in the middle of nowhere, especially with such valuable cargo. Her GPS showed limited options along this stretch of highway. mostly small rural stations that might not accommodate large trucks. Then at mile marker 162, her GPS displayed a truck stop she didn't recognize. The listing showed a 24-hour facility with diesel pumps and parking, labeled simply as Plains Fuel and Rest. The location seemed perfect, less than 10 miles ahead. Rebecca couldn't recall ever stopping there before, which was odd given how many times she'd driven this route, but perhaps it was a newer establishment. She activated her turn signal and began moving to the right lane, watching for the exit sign. Sure enough, a green highway sign appeared in her headlights. Fuel and food exit 162, 1 mile. The exit ramp curved away from the interstate through an area of flat, empty grassland. No lights were visible except for Rebecca's own headlights cutting through the darkness. The isolation struck her as unusual for a truck stop location. These facilities were typically positioned to be highly visible from the highway, with towering light poles and bright signage to attract business. But perhaps this one was set back from the road for zoning reasons or to reduce noise complaints from nearby residents. After following the access road for nearly 2 miles, far longer than Rebecca expected, she finally saw lights ahead. The truck stop materialized out of the darkness like an island in a sea of prairie grass. It was smaller than Rebecca anticipated, with just 6 fuel pumps arranged in 2 rows and a single-story building that appeared to house a convenience store and restaurant. Only one other vehicle was visible in the lot, a pickup truck parked near the building entrance. The sodium vapor lights cast everything in a sickly yellow-orange glow. Rebecca pulled up to the furthest fuel pump, positioning her truck to allow the diesel nozzle to reach her tank. As she set her air brakes and shut down the engine, she noticed how absolutely silent everything was. No highway noise filtered through from the interstate. No insects chirped in the surrounding grassland. No wind moved through the air. The silence was so complete it seemed to have physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Shaking off the unsettling feeling, Rebecca climbed down from her cab and approached the fuel pump. The equipment looked old, possibly from the 1980s, with mechanical number wheels instead of a digital display. The instruction placard was sun-faded and barely legible. Rebecca swiped her company fuel card through the reader, expecting the familiar prompts to appear. Instead, the pump simply displayed, "Please begin fueling," without requesting any pin or odometer reading. As diesel began flowing into her tank, Rebecca walked toward the building to use the restroom and grab a coffee. She needed to stretch her legs anyway, and the refrigeration unit in her trailer needed checking. The glass door to the convenience store was covered in yellowed cellophane tape and outdated advertisements for cigarette brands Rebecca hadn't seen in years. A bell chimed as she pushed the door open, the sound oddly muffled and distant. The interior of the store was dimly lit and appeared not to have been updated since the Reagan administration. Metal shelves stocked with dusty merchandise lined the narrow aisles. The products themselves looked wrong somehow, their packaging featuring old logos and designs that companies had long since abandoned. A cardboard display advertised a movie that Rebecca vaguely remembered from her childhood, promoting it as coming soon to theaters. Behind the counter sat a clerk, a thin man perhaps in his 50s, wearing a name tag that read Carl. He stared at Rebecca with an expression that seemed neither welcoming nor hostile, just blank and oddly expectant. His eyes didn't blink, and his chest didn't appear to move with breathing. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the night. "Restroom?" Rebecca asked, her voice sounding strange in the oppressive quiet of the store. The clerk slowly raised one arm and pointed toward a hallway at the back of the building, still not speaking. Still not blinking. Rebecca walked quickly past the aisles of obsolete products, feeling the clerk's unblinking gaze follow her movement. The hallway smelled of mildew and something else, something organic and rotten that Rebecca couldn't identify. The restroom was small and grotesque, with brown water stains covering most surfaces and a single flickering fluorescent bulb providing uncertain light. Rebecca decided she could wait until the next legitimate stop. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. But it wasn't quite her reflection. The woman in the mirror was older, much older, with deep lines in her face and gray shot through her hair. The reflected Rebecca looked exhausted and beaten down by years of hard living. As Rebecca stumbled backward in shock, the reflection moved differently, raising a hand to the glass and mouthing words that Rebecca couldn't hear. "Leave now." Rebecca ran from the restroom, her heart pounding. She burst back into the main store area, heading for the exit. The clerk was no longer behind the counter. Instead, he stood directly in her path to the door. That same blank expression on his face, arms hanging limply at his sides. Up close, Rebecca could see that his skin had an artificial quality, like poorly maintained wax. His eyes were glass, the eyes of a mannequin or a corpse. "Your fuel is complete," the clerk said, his voice emerging from his unmoving mouth like a poorly dubbed foreign film. "The charge is your time." Rebecca didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the statement. She pushed past the clerk, who offered no resistance, and burst through the glass door into the yellow sodium light of the parking lot. Her truck sat by the pump exactly where she'd left it, but something was wrong. The vehicle looked older, more weathered. The paint had faded and rust bloomed around the wheel wells. Rebecca ran to the driver's door and hauled herself up into the cab. Her hands shook as she turned the key, praying the engine would start. It caught on the first try, and she immediately put the truck in gear without even retracting the fuel nozzle from her tank. The hose yanked free as she accelerated away, diesel spraying across the concrete. Rebecca didn't care about the damage or the lost fuel. She had to get away from this impossible place. The access road leading back to the interstate seemed to stretch on forever, far longer than the 2 miles she'd traveled to reach the truck stop. Rebecca kept her accelerator pressed to the floor, watching her speedometer climb. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15, with the road continuing straight ahead through the featureless grassland. The truck stop remained visible in her mirrors, its lights neither growing nor shrinking in the distance, as if it were following her at the exact speed she was fleeing. Then Rebecca noticed her dashboard clock. It showed 3:47 a.m. She'd only been at the truck stop for perhaps 15 minutes, but nearly 4 hours had passed according to the clock. Impossible. Rebecca grabbed her phone to check the time, but the device wouldn't power on despite having a full charge when she'd entered the truck stop. Her GPS screen displayed only static. The mapping software crashed or corrupted. Finally, mercifully, the interstate appeared ahead, and Rebecca merged onto Highway 35 heading north. She drove for 20 miles before she felt safe enough to pull over and assess the situation. In the lights of a legitimate rest area populated with other trucks and cars, Rebecca examined her vehicle with growing horror. The wear and deterioration she'd glimpsed in the truck stop parking lot were real. Her truck had aged years in the span of minutes. The tires were more worn, the engine sounded rougher, and the odometer had advanced by thousands of miles. Rebecca checked her cargo. The refrigeration unit was still functioning, but its service hours meter showed it had been running for 8 years, 3 months, and 6 days, despite having been serviced just 2 weeks earlier in Houston. The seals on her trailer doors were brittle and cracked, weathered by time that hadn't passed in the real world. Inside, her pharmaceutical shipment remained intact and properly chilled, seemingly untouched by whatever temporal distortion had affected the rest of her equipment. Using a borrowed phone from another driver at the rest area, Rebecca called her dispatcher. The conversation was confused and alarming. According to company records, Rebecca had missed multiple check-in calls, and her truck's GPS tracker had gone offline for the past 3.5 hours. They'd been preparing to send law enforcement to search for her, assuming she'd been in an accident or the victim of a hijacking. Rebecca couldn't explain where she'd been or what had happened. How could she explain that she'd stopped at a place that existed outside of normal time, where minutes stretched into hours and years of wear happened in an instant? Rebecca completed her delivery to Minneapolis, but the truck required extensive repairs and maintenance that shouldn't have been necessary on a vehicle with so few actual miles. The company's mechanics were baffled by the advanced wear on components that should have lasted for years. Insurance investigators suspected fraud, suggesting that Rebecca had swapped her assigned truck with an older, more worn vehicle for some inexplicable reason. The suspicion damaged her reputation and led to increased scrutiny of all her subsequent runs. Worse than the professional consequences were the personal effects. Rebecca discovered that she too had aged during those missing hours. Fine lines had appeared around her eyes, her hair had lost some of its luster, and her joints ached in ways they hadn't before. A doctor estimated that she'd aged physiologically by at least 18 months, perhaps more. The biological theft of time from her life was permanent and irreversible. Rebecca became obsessed with finding planes, fuel, and rest again. She drove Highway 35 through Kansas dozens of times, searching for exit 162 or any trace of the access road leading to the impossible truck stop. She found nothing. The exit doesn't exist, at least not in the daylight world or on any current maps. But late at night, when driving through that particular stretch of Kansas prairie, Rebecca sometimes sees lights in the distance, set back from the highway. She sees the glow of sodium vapor lamps and the distinctive layout of fuel pumps, beckoning her to pull off and visit again. She never does. Rebecca Torres learned that some places exist in the margins of the world, operating under different physical laws, extracting payments that no traveler should have to pay. The road had taken time from her, years of her life stolen in exchange for fuel she'd never actually received. Her tank had been full when she finally checked it at the legitimate rest area, exactly as full as it had been before the fuel stop that wasn't. Whatever that place was, whatever entity operated it, it dealt in a currency far more valuable than money. And Rebecca knows that if she ever stops there again, it might take not just hours or years, but everything she has left until nothing remains but an empty shell behind the wheel, driving forever through an endless night on roads that don't appear on any map. Story 8. The Passenger in the Road. Daniel Kowalski had been a truck driver for only 18 months, still new enough to the profession that every trip carried an element of adventure rather than monotony. At 26 years old, he joined the industry straight out of community college after realizing that a degree in general studies wasn't going to lead anywhere meaningful. The trucking life appealed to Daniel's independent nature and his love of the open road. He drove for a mid-sized regional carrier based out of Pittsburgh, typically hauling manufactured goods throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England states on predictable routes that kept him close to home. On November 14, 2018, Daniel was assigned an unusual long-haul run to Portland, Maine, delivering industrial printing equipment. The assignment was a reward for his solid performance over his first year and a half, a chance to prove he could handle the longer routes that came with better pay and more responsibility. Daniel had carefully planned the journey, which would take him through Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and finally into Maine. He'd scheduled his driving hours to comply with federal regulations, identified suitable places for his mandatory rest breaks, and loaded playlists and podcasts for entertainment during the estimated 14-hour journey. The first leg of the trip proceeded smoothly. Daniel departed Pittsburgh at 4 a.m., catching sunrise somewhere in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. The autumn colors were spectacular, with the hardwood forest displaying brilliant reds, oranges, and golds. Daniel made his first scheduled stop at a service plaza on Interstate 84 in New York. Using the brake to fuel up, grab lunch, and verify that his cargo was properly secured. By early afternoon, he was making excellent time through Connecticut, running nearly 30 minutes ahead of his projected schedule. As evening approached and Daniel crossed into Massachusetts, the weather began to deteriorate. What had started as scattered clouds gradually thickened into a solid, overcast layer that turned the late afternoon light dim and gray. A light rain began falling around 6 p.m., just enough to require intermittent use of windshield wipers, but not enough to significantly impair visibility or require reduced speed. Daniel adjusted his route slightly to avoid passing through Boston during evening rush hour, opting instead for a more northerly path through rural Massachusetts and New Hampshire. This decision routed him onto State Highway 2, a winding two-lane road that cut through the less populated northern region of Massachusetts. The highway passed through small towns separated by stretches of dense forest, a scenic route during daylight but somewhat isolating after dark. Daniel didn't mind. The reduced traffic was actually preferable to fighting congestion on the interstate, and his GPS showed the route would save him nearly 45 minutes despite the lower speed limits. By 7:30 p.m., full darkness had fallen and the rain had intensified to a steady downpour. Daniel's wipers beat a rhythmic pattern across his windshield, clearing away the water in brief intervals before it accumulated again. The road was essentially empty, with only occasional headlights approaching from the opposite direction. Daniel's high beams illuminated the rain-slicked pavement ahead, the painted center line, and the dark wall of trees pressing close on both sides of the highway. Then Daniel saw the figure standing in the middle of his lane. A woman, he realized in the split second before he instinctively slammed on his brakes. She stood absolutely motionless, approximately 50 feet ahead, directly in his path, wearing what appeared to be a white dress that clung to her body from the rain. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if her neck were broken. Her long dark hair was plastered across her face, obscuring her features. Daniel's truck shuddered as the anti-lock brakes engaged, the trailer threatening to jackknife on the wet pavement. His heart hammered in his chest as he fought to maintain control while simultaneously trying to steer around the figure. The truck's headlights illuminated her in harsh detail as he approached. She didn't move, didn't react to the 50,000-pound vehicle bearing down on her. In the instant before Daniel's truck reached her position, he saw her head snap upright, her hair falling away from a face that was pale and wrong, with eyes that were solid black from lid to lid, no white or iris visible. Then his truck passed through the space where she'd been standing. No impact, no sound, just the sensation of driving through empty air. Daniel's truck finally came to a complete stop about 100 yards down the road, sitting diagonally across both lanes. He sat gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white, his breathing rapid and shallow. In his side mirrors, the road behind him was empty. No figure, no body, nothing but rain-swept pavement and darkness. Daniel tried to rationalize what he'd seen, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the hypnotic effect of driving through rain at night. Perhaps a deer or other animal that his mind had interpreted as human in that brief moment before he'd reacted. The stress of his first long-haul journey manifesting as a vision. Any explanation was preferable to accepting that he'd seen something genuinely paranormal standing in the middle of a Massachusetts highway. After several minutes of deliberate breathing exercises, Daniel carefully maneuvered his truck back into the proper lane and resumed his journey, albeit at a significantly reduced speed. He considered pulling over at the next town and finding a place to rest, abandoning his plan to drive straight through to Portland. But his pride and his determination to prove himself capable pushed him onward. He'd been driving for less than 16 hours total, well within legal limits, and he couldn't let one strange incident derail his first major assignment. For the next 20 miles, Daniel saw nothing unusual. The highway continued its winding path through the forest. The rain maintained its steady intensity, and his truck rolled northward toward New Hampshire without incident. Daniel's heart rate returned to normal, and he began to feel foolish about his earlier panic. He'd overreacted to a shadow or a trick of light, nothing more. Then he saw her again. The same figure in the same white dress standing in the middle of the road ahead, arms at her sides, head tilted at that broken angle. This time, Daniel was prepared. He maintained his speed and course, watching carefully as his truck approached. The figure grew larger in his windshield, the details becoming clearer. The white dress was actually a nightgown, torn and stained with dark patches that might have been blood or mud or something else. Her feet were bare, bone white against the black pavement. Her skin had a blue-gray tint, the color of a body that had been in cold water for days. As before, Daniel's truck passed through her without resistance. She vanished as if she'd never existed, just disappeared as the front of his vehicle reached her position. Daniel checked his mirrors obsessively, expecting to see her standing in the road behind him. The road remained empty, but then perhaps a quarter-mile ahead he saw her again, once more standing directly in his lane, waiting with that terrible patience. Daniel's hands shook on the steering wheel. This wasn't his imagination, this wasn't fatigue. Something was manifesting repeatedly in front of his truck, appearing and disappearing with impossible consistency. The figure's appearance in his headlights became almost routine over the next hour. Every few miles, sometimes more frequently, she would be there, standing and waiting. Each time Daniel drove through her incorporeal form. Each time she vanished only to reappear further up the road. He tried turning off the highway, taking any side road that presented itself, but the rural area offered few options. The side roads either dead-ended after a few miles or looped back to the main highway. His GPS seemed unreliable, occasionally glitching and showing his truck's position in the middle of forests or lakes rather than on the road. When Daniel attempted to call for help, his phone displayed full signal strength but couldn't complete any calls. The line would connect, he'd hear ringing, but when someone answered, only static came through. The figure began to change as the night progressed. The white nightgown became more tattered and stained. Her skin took on a more pronounced blue-gray color, and water began dripping from her clothing and hair, pooling around her bare feet even though she stood on solid pavement. Most disturbing were her eyes, those solid black orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They began to weep thick, dark fluid that ran down her face like tar tears. Around midnight, Daniel passed a sign welcoming him to New Hampshire. He should have crossed the state line over an hour earlier based on his GPS. But time seemed to have become unreliable along with distance. His truck's odometer showed he'd traveled nearly 200 miles since first seeing the figure, yet his fuel gauge indicated he'd used fuel appropriate for maybe 70 miles. Nothing made sense. The road just continued endlessly through the rain-soaked darkness, and the figure kept appearing, kept waiting, kept staring with those terrible black eyes. Then, after what felt like hours but might have been minutes or days, the figure did something different. Instead of standing motionless as Daniel's truck approached, she raised one arm and pointed. Not at Daniel, but to the side of the road where his headlights picked out a reflective sign marking a narrow dirt road leading off into the forest. The gesture was unmistakable. She was showing him something, directing him to turn. Every instinct screamed at Daniel not to follow that pointing finger, not to deviate from the highway into the dark woods. But what choice did he have? He'd been driving through this nightmare loop for hours with no end in sight, with the figure appearing over and over in an endless cycle. Maybe whatever this thing wanted, it would leave him alone once it got what it wanted. Or maybe the dirt road led to his death. to some clearing in the forest where his truck would be found years later, his skeletal remains still gripping the steering wheel. Daniel made the turn. The dirt road was barely wide enough for his truck, with tree branches scraping along both sides of his trailer as he carefully navigated the uneven surface. The road descended gradually, winding deeper into the forest. After approximately half a mile, Daniel's headlights illuminated a small clearing containing the ruins of what had once been a house. Only the stone foundation remained, along with a collapsed chimney and piles of rotted timber reclaimed by moss and vines. Near the foundation, barely visible in the darkness and rain, Daniel could make out a depression in the ground partially filled with water. An old well, perhaps, or the remains of a cellar. As Daniel sat in his idling truck staring at the ruins through his rain-streaked windshield, the figure appeared one final time. She stood beside the water-filled depression, no longer looking at Daniel but down into the dark water at her feet. Then she stepped forward and sank into the depression, disappearing beneath the surface without a ripple. Daniel didn't move for a long time. Eventually, he backed his truck carefully up the narrow dirt road until he reached the highway. The rain had stopped. The road signs were clear and readable, showing reasonable mileage to nearby towns. His phone suddenly had service again, and when he checked his GPS, it showed his position accurately on State Highway 2, roughly 10 miles from the New Hampshire border, exactly where he should be based on his original route. Daniel drove straight to Portland without stopping, arriving at his delivery point just after 6 a.m. He'd somehow lost only about 2 hours compared to his original schedule, despite the hours he'd spent in that impossible loop. After unloading his cargo, Daniel filed a report with the local police about what he'd seen, giving them the approximate location of the dirt road and the ruined foundation. He didn't mention the figure or the paranormal aspects, instead claiming he'd noticed something suspicious while driving and thought it should be investigated. 2 days later, a police investigator contacted Daniel. They'd found the location based on his directions. The water-filled depression was indeed an old well, and it had contained human remains. A young woman who'd been missing for 6 years, a local college student who disappeared without a trace after visiting friends in the area. The preliminary investigation suggested she'd been murdered and her body disposed of in the abandoned well, which had been covered by debris and forgotten until Daniel's report led police to the location. Daniel never drove through that part of Massachusetts again. He requested route assignments that kept him away from rural New England, and his company obliged without questioning why. He doesn't talk about what really happened that night, about the figure in the white nightgown who appeared and disappeared for hours, leading him eventually to her own hidden grave. He doesn't tell people that he'd been chosen as a witness, that something dead and desperate had reached across the barrier between life and whatever comes after to ensure it would be found. Sometimes on rainy nights when Daniel is driving alone through darkness, he sees a figure standing at the side of the road. Not in his lane, not blocking his path, just standing and watching as he passes. It's always the same woman, no longer blue-gray and dripping, but restored to how she must have looked in life, healthy and whole. She never tries to stop him or communicate. She just watches. And Daniel thinks perhaps she's grateful that in whatever way spirits can feel and express emotion, she's acknowledging what he did for her. He hopes that's what it means. The alternative, that she's still trapped and still trying to tell him something, is too terrible to consider. Because Daniel knows that if she appears in his lane again, head tilted at that broken angle, he'll have to follow wherever she leads, finding whatever other horror needs to be brought into the light. Story 9. The Convoy to Nowhere. Stephen Garrett had spent 23 years behind the wheel of a semi-truck, long enough that driving had become as natural as breathing. At 51 years old, he'd seen the entire country multiple times over. from the frozen highways of Alaska to the sweltering interstates of southern Texas. Stephen drove for himself now, an owner-operator with his own truck and trailer, contracting with various companies for loads that needed hauling. The independence suited him. After 2 decades working for corporate fleets with their endless regulations and micromanagement, Stephen preferred to choose his own routes, set his own schedule, and answer to nobody but himself and the clients who hired him. On January 8, 2021, Stephen picked up a load of agricultural equipment in Amarillo, Texas, bound for Great Falls, Montana. The job paid well for what should have been a straightforward 3-day run-up through Colorado and Wyoming. Stephen had hauled similar loads dozens of times, and the winter weather forecast looked favorable with clear conditions predicted along his entire route. He'd planned to take Interstate 25 north through Denver, then cut west on Interstate 90 through Wyoming and into Montana. It was the most direct route, and one Stephen knew well from years of experience. The first day of driving passed without incident. Stephen made it from Amarillo to Cheyenne, Wyoming by early evening, stopping at a truck stop he'd visited countless times before. He performed his routine, walk-around inspection, checking his cargo straps and ensuring everything was secure for the next day's drive. After a hot meal and a few hours of sleep in his truck's sleeper berth, Stephen was back on the road before dawn, heading northwest toward Casper. The Wyoming landscape in winter was harsh but beautiful, with rolling plains covered in patchy snow and distant mountain ranges sharp against the pale sky. Traffic was light on the interstate, mostly other commercial trucks making their own deliveries across the mountain west. Around 10 a.m., Stephen's CB radio crackled to life with a transmission from another driver behind him on the highway. "Breaker 19, this is the blue Peterbilt coming up on your 6. Anybody out there hauling northbound?" the voice asked, friendly and casual in the way truckers communicated with each other on the road. Stephen grabbed his microphone and responded, confirming he was heading north toward Montana. The other driver introduced himself as Tommy, said he was hauling lumber from Colorado to Billings, Montana, following a similar route. They chatted idly for a few minutes about road conditions and weather before Tommy suggested they travel together for safety and company. Convoy driving was common practice among truckers, especially in winter conditions. Having another truck nearby provided immediate help if something went wrong, and the companionship helped combat the monotony of long drives through empty country. Stephen agreed readily, adjusting his speed to let Tommy's blue Peterbilt catch up and fall in behind his truck. A few minutes later, another driver joined the conversation on the CB, a woman named Patricia who was hauling frozen food in a refrigerated trailer. She was also heading north and was happy to join their informal convoy. By early afternoon, the group had grown to 6 trucks, all traveling in loose formation along Interstate 25. They maintained spacing that allowed other vehicles to merge and pass, but kept each other in sight. The conversation on Channel 19 was lively, with drivers sharing stories, warning each other about speed traps, and generally enjoying the camaraderie that made trucking bearable during long hauls. Stephen found himself relaxing, appreciating the company after several days of solo driving. Around 3 p.m., as the convoy approached Casper, one of the other drivers, a man named Luis, suggested they take an alternate route to avoid some construction that supposedly was causing delays on the main interstate. Luis claimed he'd heard about it on a traffic report and knew a state highway that would save them nearly an hour. The alternate route would take them through more remote areas but would eventually rejoin the interstate further north near Buffalo, Wyoming. Several drivers, including Stephen, were skeptical about deviating from the planned route, but Luis was insistent that the time savings would be significant. Tommy, the driver who'd initially suggested forming the convoy, backed Luis's suggestion. Patricia agreed as well, and gradually the other drivers were persuaded. Stephen felt pressure to go along with the group decision, not wanting to seem uncooperative or overly cautious. Against his better judgment, he followed when the lead trucks took the exit onto State Highway 487, a two-lane road heading northwest through open rangeland. The highway was empty and well-maintained, cutting a straight line across the barren landscape. The convoy maintained good speed, and for the first hour, everything seemed fine. But as afternoon faded toward evening, Stephen began to notice something odd. The landscape wasn't changing. They'd been driving for over 90 miles according to his odometer, but the scenery looked identical to where they'd been when they first exited the interstate. The same rolling hills, the same scattered patches of sagebrush, the same distant mountain range that never seemed to get closer or further away. Stephen mentioned his observation on the CB radio, expecting the other drivers to share his concern. Instead, they dismissed it, saying that Wyoming landscape all looked the same and he was just being paranoid. Tommy made a joke about Stephen needing to get his eyes checked, and the others laughed. Stephen felt foolish and let the matter drop, but he couldn't shake his growing unease. He checked his GPS, which showed the convoy progressing along the highway exactly as expected, but something felt fundamentally wrong. As darkness fell, the convoy's headlights illuminated the empty highway ahead. They'd been driving on the state highway for nearly 3 hours now, far longer than Luis had indicated it would take to rejoin the interstate. Stephen called out on the CB, asking when they'd reach the junction with Interstate 25. Luis responded that it should be coming up soon, maybe another 20 miles. But 20 miles passed, then 30, then 50, with no sign of the interstate or any other roads. Stephen tried to raise concerns again, suggesting they turn around and go back to where they'd left the interstate. This time, the other drivers' responses were strange. Their voices on the CB sounded flat and monotone, lacking the warmth and personality they'd displayed earlier. They insisted everything was fine, that they were making good time, that Stephen should just keep driving and stop asking questions. When Stephen pressed further, demanding to know why they'd been on this highway for so long without seeing any towns or intersections, the drivers stopped responding entirely. The CB went silent except for occasional bursts of static. Stephen made a decision. He began gradually reducing his speed, allowing the other trucks to pull ahead. If something was wrong with this route, he wasn't going to blindly follow the convoy any further. As his truck slowed, Stephen watched the other 5 vehicles continue forward at their steady pace, their taillights receding into the darkness ahead. He expected one of them to notice he was falling behind and radio to ask what was wrong. But the CB remained silent. When the last of the convoy's lights had disappeared beyond his range of vision, Stephen turned his truck around, performing a careful U-turn to head back south the way they'd come. Immediately, things changed. His headlights picked out details he hadn't noticed on the drive north. Abandoned buildings sat back from the road, old ranch structures with collapsed roofs and empty windows. Road signs appeared, but they were weathered and unreadable, the paint peeled away to bare metal. And then Stephen saw them lining the side of the highway, vehicles. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, sat in various states of decay in the scrubland flanking the road. Semi-trucks, cars, vans, motorcycles, all abandoned and slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Some looked recent, with rust just beginning to claim the metal and grass growing through broken windows. Others had been there for decades, reduced to skeletal frames barely recognizable as vehicles. Stephen slowed his truck to a crawl, his spotlight sweeping across the automotive graveyard. Every truck he illuminated was a commercial semi, and many still bore traces of company names and DOT numbers on their doors. Stephen saw trucks from carriers he recognized, regional companies and major nationals. Some of the vehicles had cargo still in their trailers, visible through gaps in corroded panels. But there were no signs of the drivers, no bodies or belongings visible, just the abandoned vehicles lined up like monuments in a vehicular cemetery. Stephen's blood ran cold as he realized what he was seeing. This highway was a trap, something that lured drivers off the main roads with promises of shortcuts and time savings, then led them forever through an empty landscape until their fuel ran out and their trucks joined the collection of abandoned vehicles. The other drivers in his convoy, Tommy and Patricia and Luis and the others, they might have been real people at one point, or they might have been something else, echoes or lures that manifested to lead the unwary off the safe routes. The highway behind Stephen no longer looked the same as when he'd traveled it heading north. The pavement was cracked and broken with weeds growing through the gaps. The landscape had taken on a surreal quality, with the mountains in the distance seeming to shift position when Stephen wasn't looking directly at them. The sky above held too many stars, more than should be visible even in the clear darkness of rural Wyoming, and their positions were wrong, forming constellations Stephen didn't recognize. Stephen pushed his truck as hard as he dared on the deteriorating road, desperately searching for the intersection where they'd originally turned off Interstate 25. He'd only driven about 3 hours on this highway, maybe 200 miles total. At a minimum, he should reach the interstate in less than 3 hours of driving back the way he came. But 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3, with no change in the endless highway. His fuel gauge was dropping rapidly, far faster than it should. Stephen calculated that he had maybe 2 more hours of driving before his tanks ran dry. Then Stephen saw lights ahead. Not the glow of the interstate or a town, but headlights, approaching from the opposite direction. As the vehicle got closer, Stephen recognized the distinctive profile of a semi-truck. It was Tommy's blue Peterbilt driving south toward him. Behind it came Patricia's refrigerated trailer, then Luis's truck, then the others. The entire convoy was heading back south, following the same route Stephen was taking. Stephen's radio crackled to life. "Stephen, where did you go? We've been looking all over for you." It was Tommy's voice, but wrong somehow, with an echo and resonance that didn't sound quite human. "We need to stay together. It's not safe out here alone. Come on back with us, we'll find the way together." The convoy of trucks slowed as they approached Stephen's position, clearly intending to turn around and travel north with him. Stephen didn't trust them. Whatever these things were, they weren't going to help him escape. They were part of the trap. Perhaps the most insidious part, the familiar voices and friendly faces that kept drivers pacified while the highway consumed them. Stephen grabbed his microphone and keyed it, saying the only thing he could think of. "No, I'm going home. You're not real and I'm not following you anywhere." The effect was immediate and terrifying. The approaching trucks seemed to glitch, their forms flickering like damaged video. The headlights flared impossibly bright, then dimmed to blood red. The trucks accelerated toward Stephen, their engines roaring with a sound that wasn't mechanical but organic, like the scream of some massive beast. Stephen cranked his steering wheel hard, taking his truck off the crumbling highway and onto the scrubland beside it. His vehicle bounced and lurched over the uneven ground, his cargo shifting dangerously. Behind him, the phantom convoy followed, leaving the road to pursue him across the open prairie. Stephen could see them in his mirrors, and they no longer looked like trucks at all. The shapes were wrong, distorted and stretched, with too many wheels and lights in impossible positions. They were predators, and he was prey. And the pretense of humanity had been abandoned now that Stephen had rejected them. Stephen's fuel gauge hit empty. His engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The truck rolled forward on momentum alone, gradually slowing until it came to rest in a shallow depression between 2 hills. The pursuing convoy converged on his position, surrounding his truck in a circle. Stephen sat in his darkened cab, watching the things outside close in, preparing for whatever came next. Then dawn broke. Stephen doesn't remember the transition from night to day. One moment it was full darkness with the nightmare convoy surrounding him, and the next, the sun was rising over the eastern horizon, revealing ordinary Wyoming landscape. Stephen's truck sat in a turnout on the side of Interstate 25, exactly where he'd pulled over to rest the night before any of this had started. His fuel tanks were 3/4 full. His cargo was secure. According to his logs and GPS, he'd never deviated from the interstate at all. Stephen got out of his truck and walked around it, searching for evidence of his off-road excursion. The tires and undercarriage were clean with no mud or grass, nothing to suggest the truck had left paved roads. He checked his CB radio, scrolling through the memory to find records of the conversations with Tommy and the others. The radio's log was empty. No incoming or outgoing transmissions were recorded for the past 24 hours. Stephen completed his delivery to Great Falls 2 days later, but he never drove alone through remote areas again. He took only routes that kept him on major interstates, and he never accepted invitations to join convoys with drivers he didn't know personally. Because Stephen understands now that the road has predators, things that hunt truckers by exploiting their trust and camaraderie. He'd been given a chance to escape, a warning that came in time for him to refuse the trap. The abandoned trucks lining that impossible highway were evidence that most drivers didn't get that chance, or didn't recognize it when it came. They followed the convoy into the nowhere places, and they never found their way back. Stephen carries that knowledge with him on every run, a weight heavier than any cargo. A reminder that some shortcuts lead to destinations from which there is no return. Story 10. The Way Station. Thomas Briggs had been hauling freight for Midwest Transport Solutions for 11 years, maintaining a spotless safety record and consistently receiving commendations for his professionalism and reliability. At 42 years old, Thomas approached trucking as a career rather than just a job, taking pride in every aspect of his work, from his meticulously maintained truck to his careful attention to regulations. He specialized in oversized loads, hauling construction equipment and industrial machinery that required special permits and route planning. The work was more complex than standard freight, but it paid better and gave Thomas a sense of accomplishment that routine deliveries couldn't match. On April 3, 2019, Thomas was hauling a large CNC milling machine from Detroit to Kansas City. The machine and its custom shipping frame brought his total cargo weight to just under 79,000 pounds, safely below the 80,000-pound federal limit, but heavy enough that Thomas needed to be cautious about weight distribution and route selection. He'd obtained the necessary oversized permits and had mapped out his route carefully, identifying which highways could accommodate his load's dimensions and which way stations he'd need to pass through for inspections. Thomas departed Detroit in the early morning hours, heading west on Interstate 94 through Michigan. The spring weather was cooperative, with clear skies and moderate temperatures that made for comfortable driving. Thomas had driven this route many times before and knew what to expect. Probably 6 hours to Chicago if traffic cooperated, another 8 hours from Chicago to Kansas City. With appropriate breaks, he'd complete the journey in a long day's work and have the machine delivered ahead of schedule. Around noon, as Thomas crossed into Indiana, his logbook reminded him that he needed to stop at the next available way station. Federal regulations required commercial vehicles above certain weights to stop at these facilities for weight verification and safety inspections. Thomas had passed through hundreds of way stations over his career without issue. His truck was always properly maintained, his logs were meticulous, and his cargo was secured to professional standards. Way station stops were routine, usually taking no more than 15 minutes unless inspectors decided to perform a detailed Level 1 inspection. The sign appeared beside the highway. All trucks must stop way station 1 mile. Thomas activated his turn signal and began moving to the right lane, reducing his speed as he approached the exit ramp. The way station sat back from the interstate in a large paved area, with the standard layout Thomas had seen at dozens of similar facilities. A scale platform stretched across the entrance road where trucks could be weighed while rolling at slow speeds. Beyond the scale was a parking area and a single-story building housing the inspection offices. What struck Thomas as unusual was how empty the facility appeared. Normally, weigh stations on major interstates were busy places with multiple trucks passing through at any given time and inspectors moving between vehicles conducting their examinations. This station was completely deserted. No other trucks were visible in the parking area, and the building's windows were dark despite it being midday. The flagpole in front of the building held no flag, just an empty pole swaying slightly in the breeze. Thomas rolled across the scale platform at the required 5 miles per hour, watching his weight display for the readout that would indicate whether he needed to pull into the parking area for inspection or if he could return directly to the interstate. But the scale readout didn't change. The LED display that should have shown his truck's weight remained blank, not even showing zeros, just an empty black screen. Thomas stopped his truck just past the scale, uncertain whether he should proceed to the building or attempt to cross the scale again. He decided to walk to the building and speak with the inspectors directly. Perhaps the scale was malfunctioning, and they needed to use backup equipment to verify his weight. Thomas set his air brakes and climbed down from his cab, taking his logbook and permit folder with him. The parking lot pavement was cracked and weathered, with weeds growing through the gaps. As Thomas approached the building, he noticed more signs of neglect. The windows were covered in dust and grime. Some panes were cracked and the paint on the door was peeling badly. Thomas tried the door, expecting it to be locked. Instead, it swung open easily, revealing a dark interior. "Hello? Anybody here?" Thomas called out, his voice echoing in the empty building. He fumbled along the wall until he found a light switch, flipping it up. Fluorescent tubes flickered to life overhead, illuminating an abandoned office. Desks sat covered in dust, with ancient computer monitors and keyboards dating back to the 1980s or 90s. Papers were scattered across surfaces yellowed and brittle with age. A calendar on one wall showed February 1992. This weigh station hadn't been in operation for decades. Thomas backed out of the building, a sense of profound wrongness settling over him. The sign on the interstate had clearly indicated an active facility, mandatory stop for all commercial vehicles. But this place was abandoned, had been abandoned for years, if not decades. Thomas looked back toward the interstate, barely visible through a line of trees. He could see vehicles passing on the highway, but something about their movement seemed off. They were too fast, blurring past like time-lapse photography, or too slow, crawling along at a fraction of normal speed. Thomas decided to leave immediately. Whatever this place was, he didn't want to be here. He walked quickly back to his truck, planning to skip the weigh station inspection and take his chances with getting pulled over later to explain the situation. But as he reached his truck, Thomas noticed something that made his heart sink. His truck looked different. The paint was faded, the chrome fixtures were tarnished, and rust had bloomed along the lower panels and wheel wells. His truck had aged decades in the minutes he'd been away from it. Thomas grabbed the door handle and hauled himself up into the cab. The interior showed the same deterioration. The seat fabric was cracked and torn, the dashboard was faded and brittle, and the windshield was hazed with countless tiny pits. Thomas turned the key, praying the engine would start. It turned over sluggishly but caught, producing a rough, idle, and concerning rattling sounds. Black smoke poured from the exhaust stacks. He put the truck in gear and began driving toward the weigh station exit, intending to return to the interstate. But the exit that should have been directly ahead was no longer visible. The paved area just continued in all directions, hundreds of yards of cracked pavement stretching away in every direction. Thomas could see the abandoned building behind him in his mirrors. But ahead there was only empty pavement and in the distance other vehicles. Dozens of trucks scattered across the vast lot, all appearing abandoned and deteriorated. Thomas accelerated, driving in what he hoped was the direction of the highway. His truck protested, the engine misfiring and the transmission slipping. After several minutes of driving, Thomas reached one of the other trucks. It was an older Peterbilt, probably from the early 2000s based on its styling. The paint had faded to almost nothing, and the tires were rotted off the wheels. Thomas stopped beside it and got out, approaching the cab carefully. The driver's door was unlocked. Inside, a human skeleton sat in the driver's seat, still wearing the remains of clothing and a trucker's cap. The bones were yellowed and weathered, suggesting this person had died years ago. Fighting down panic, Thomas searched through the cab for identification or anything that might explain what had happened. He found a logbook, its pages brittle and water-damaged but partially readable. The last entries were dated June 7th, 2003. The driver had stopped at a way station on Interstate 94 in Indiana and had never left. The final entry, written in an increasingly shaky hand, described being unable to find the exit, the truck deteriorating, food and water running out. Thomas ran back to his own truck, his mind racing. 16 years. That driver had been trapped here for 16 years until death by starvation or dehydration finally ended his ordeal. And based on the number of abandoned trucks Thomas could see scattered across this impossible parking lot, dozens of other drivers had suffered the same fate. This place was a trap, something that appeared as an ordinary way station but existed outside of normal space and time, collecting trucks and their drivers and keeping them until death. Thomas drove for hours, searching desperately for an exit. His fuel gauge dropped rapidly, far faster than the distance traveled should have consumed. He passed other trucks, some older than the first one he'd examined, dating back to the 70s and 80s based on their styling. Some of the trucks contained remains, skeletons of drivers who died in their cabs. Others were empty, the drivers apparently having abandoned their vehicles to search on foot for escape, their fates unknown. As his fuel gauge approached empty, Thomas stopped his truck and tried to think logically. There had to be a way out. The way station had been designed to trap people, but traps had mechanisms, had flaws. Thomas thought about the sign on the interstate, the mandatory stop directive. What if the trap only worked on people who followed the rules? What if he'd never stopped in the first place, just kept driving past the way station despite the legal requirement? But that didn't help him now. He was already trapped inside, and thinking about what he should have done differently wouldn't free him. Thomas considered the timeline. He'd entered the way station around noon. If time was passing normally outside, it was now evening, maybe 8 or 9 p.m. His dispatcher would be expecting check-in calls that hadn't come. By tomorrow morning, when he failed to arrive for his delivery, the company would start trying to locate him. Eventually, someone would investigate, would find that Thomas's truck had entered the way station and never exited. Would they be able to see this place from outside? Or did it only exist for those caught inside? Thomas remembered the vehicles he'd seen on the interstate moving at wrong speeds. Perhaps time flowed differently here. Or perhaps this place existed in a pocket dimension that intersected with the real world, only at the moment a truck passed through the entrance. If that was true, no rescue would ever come. The outside world would show that Thomas's truck had simply vanished, disappeared without explanation. Another mystery of the highway. Thomas walked around his truck, examining it by the light of his flashlight. The deterioration was advanced but not complete. His truck was still functional, still mobile, which meant he'd been here for years subjectively, but perhaps only hours or days in the real world. Or perhaps time was accelerating for his vehicle while moving normally for him. Nothing made sense. The physics of this place were incomprehensible. Then Thomas noticed something on the ground, fresh tire tracks, or at least fresher than anything else here. The tracks led away from his position, heading in a direction Thomas hadn't explored yet. Someone or something had moved through this area recently. Thomas got back in his truck and followed the tracks, his remaining fuel dangerously low. The tracks led through the maze of abandoned vehicles, winding between rusted hulks and skeletal frames. After nearly an hour of slow pursuit, Thomas's headlights picked out a truck ahead that looked distinctly more recent than the others around it. A modern freightliner similar to his own, weathered but not completely deteriorated. As Thomas approached, he saw a figure standing beside the truck. A man, perhaps in his 60s, with long gray hair and an unkempt beard, wearing the remains of what had once been a trucker's uniform. The man didn't run or show fear as Thomas's truck approached. He just stood there, watching with hollow eyes. Thomas stopped his truck and got out slowly, holding his hands visible and non-threatening. "How long have you been here?" Thomas asked. The man didn't respond immediately, just stared at Thomas as if he'd forgotten how language worked. Finally, in a raspy voice that suggested he rarely spoke anymore, the man said, "I don't know. Long time, years, can't tell anymore. Days, years, all the same." Thomas asked if the man knew a way out, if he'd found any exit in all his time trapped here. The man shook his head slowly, then paused. "Maybe. There's a place, sometimes I see it, where the light's different, but every time I get close it moves like it's teasing me, keeping me hoping." The man gave Thomas directions, or tried to. His descriptions were vague and possibly delusional, referencing landmarks that Thomas couldn't identify. But it was something, a chance. Thomas offered to take the man with him to work together to find the exit. The man refused, saying he didn't want to waste energy on hope anymore, that waiting for death was easier than struggling. Thomas couldn't persuade him. The man just turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of abandoned trucks. Thomas never saw him again. Following the man's confused directions as best he could interpret them, Thomas drove toward an area where he thought he'd noticed the light had a slightly different quality. More natural sunlight rather than the flat, shadowless illumination that seemed to permeate most of this place. His fuel gauge read completely empty now, the engine running on fumes and will. Any moment the truck would die and Thomas would join the collection of abandoned vehicles and trapped drivers. Then, impossibly, he saw it, the exit. Not the road leading back to the interstate, but a simple gap between two sections of pavement where grass and trees were visible, where natural daylight streamed through. The gap was barely wide enough for his truck, and Thomas had no way to know if it truly led to escape or if it was just another cruel trick of this place. But his fuel was gone, his options exhausted. Thomas aimed his truck for the gap and accelerated with the last of his momentum. The truck passed through the gap and reality lurched. Thomas felt a sensation like falling, his stomach dropping as everything around him seemed to twist and distort. Then his truck was rolling down a grassy embankment, bouncing over uneven ground before coming to rest in a shallow ditch beside Interstate 94. Thomas could see the highway 20 feet away, vehicles passing normally. The way station was visible behind him, looking active and well-maintained, with other trucks going through the scales. Thomas sat in his truck for over an hour, shaking, not trusting what he was seeing. Eventually, a state trooper pulled up to check on him, asking if he needed assistance. Thomas mumbled something about mechanical trouble and missing his exit. The trooper helped guide him back onto the highway, and Thomas continued his journey. He never stopped at that way station or any other in Indiana ever again. He'd risk the tickets, risk losing his job, before he'd ever voluntarily enter one of those facilities in this state. Thomas completed his delivery to Kansas City 2 days late, claiming mechanical issues had delayed him. The company docked his pay but didn't press for details. Thomas never told anyone what had really happened, but he researched the way station afterward. The facility was built in 1987 on the site of a much older station that had closed in the early 90s. There were reports, rumors really, of trucks that had gone missing along this stretch of highway over the years, vehicles that had simply disappeared without explanation, drivers never found. Thomas wondered how many of those missing trucks and drivers were still trapped in that impossible place, wandering through a parking lot that stretched forever, slowly starving or dying of thirst while their vehicles rusted around them. He'd escaped, but only barely, and only through luck or chance or perhaps the intervention of something that had taken pity on him. Thomas still drives trucks, but he checks and double-checks every way station sign he sees, making certain the facility ahead is genuinely open and active before he ever considers stopping. Because he knows now that the road has places where the normal rules don't apply, where space and time twist into cruel traps that catch the unwary. And once you're caught, once you've stopped at the way station that doesn't truly exist, there might be no escape at all.